Hello there, dear listeners. Before we begin tonight's tale, I hope your day has treated you kindly, wherever you may be in this vast world of ours. Perhaps it's evening where you are, or maybe the quiet hours of early morning have found you seeking rest. Whether you're listening from bustling cities or peaceful countryside, from mountain peaks or seaside shores, know that you're welcome here in this sacred space we've created together. If you find comfort in these stories, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber, where we gather each night to explore the timeless truths that have guided humanity through the ages. Tonight, we journey back through the mists of time to ancient Babylon, to a night when the very finger of the divine wrote upon palace walls, and an empire learned that no earthly power stands beyond the reach of heaven's justice. The year was 539, before the Common Era, and the great city of Babylon sprawled along the banks of the Euphrates River like a jewel cast upon the earth. Within its towering walls, the hanging gardens cascaded in verdant terraces. The Tower of Babel reached toward the heavens, and the palace of King Belshazzar gleamed with the accumulated wealth of conquered nations. On this particular evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, the palace hummed with preparation for a feast unlike any other. Servants scurried through corridors lined with glazed brick murals depicting lions and dragons, carrying platters of delicacies from every corner of the known world. The finest wines from the hills of Judah, exotic spices from distant India, and fruits that glistened like precious stones filled the tables. King Belshazzar, grandson of the great Nebuchadnezzar, had spared no expense. The banquet hall stretched vast as a temple, its ceiling supported by columns carved from single blocks of marble, each one telling the story of Babylonian conquest and glory. Golden lamps suspended on silver chains cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with tapestries, depicting the gods of Babylon in all their imagined splendour. Yet beyond the palace walls, unseen by the revellers within, the armies of Cyrus the Persian stretched across the horizon like a dark sea. For months they had laid siege to the great city, but Babylon's walls had never been breached, her gates never forced. The Babylonians had grown complacent in their strength, confident that their city was impregnable, their empire eternal. As night fell and torches blazed to life throughout the city, 1,000 noble guests made their way through the palace gates. They came dressed in silk and purple, adorned with gold and precious stones, their laughter echoing through the corridors as they anticipated the evening's pleasures. The sound of lyres and flutes drifted through the warm air, mingling with the voices of singers whose melodies spoke of victory and endless prosperity. King Belshazzar himself appeared resplendent in robes of deepest blue, a golden crown upon his brow, rings flashing on his fingers as he gestured grandly to his guests. He was a man in the prime of life, his beard oiled and perfumed, his eyes bright with wine and confidence. This night, he had declared, would be remembered for generations as the greatest feast Babylon had ever witnessed. But even as the celebration reached its crescendo, even as the wine flowed like water and the music swelled to fill every corner of the vast hall, dark currents moved beneath the surface of the evening's joy. For this was not merely a feast, but an act of defiance against the very heavens themselves. As the evening wore on and the wine loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions, King Belshazzar rose from his golden throne, swaying slightly as he surveyed the sea of faces before him. The hall fell gradually silent, 1,000 conversations dying away as all eyes turned toward their sovereign. In the flickering lamplight, his face bore an expression of cruel amusement, as if he harboured some secret that would shock and delight his guests. "My lords and ladies," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the vast space. "Tonight we celebrate not merely the glory of Babylon, but the supremacy of our gods over all the earth. We have conquered nations, we have humbled kings, and we have taken the treasures of their temples as trophies of our victories." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Many of the nobles present had been part of those conquests, had seen the wealth of distant lands flow into Babylon's coffers. They raised their goblets in salute, the wine within glinting like liquid rubies in the torchlight. But Belshazzar was not finished. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous light as he continued, "Yet there is one treasure, taken from one temple, that we have never properly honoured. Tonight that changes." He clapped his hands, and servants appeared as if from nowhere, carrying between them objects that made the assembled nobles gasp in recognition and wonder. These were vessels of pure gold and silver, wrought with such exquisite craftsmanship that they seemed to glow within a light. Cups and bowls, pitchers and goblets, each one a masterpiece of the metalworker's art. These were the sacred vessels of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, taken by Nebuchadnezzar when he conquered that holy city decades before. They had been stored away in the temple of Marduk, treated with the respectful caution due to objects sacred to another people's god. But tonight, under the influence of wine and the intoxication of power, Belshazzar had decided to make them part of his feast. "Behold," the king proclaimed, lifting one of the golden goblets high above his head, "the vessels of the God of the Jews, who could not protect his own temple from our armies, whose people even now languish in exile throughout our empire. Tonight we drink from these cups and show all the world which gods truly hold dominion over the earth." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, though some of the older nobles shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They remembered the strange stories told about the Hebrew God, the plagues that had befallen Egypt, the walls of Jericho falling at the blast of trumpets. But wine and peer pressure overcame their caution, and soon they too were caught up in the moment's enthusiasm. Servants moved through the hall, distributing the sacred vessels among the guests. Belshazzar himself took the largest of the golden goblets, a magnificent piece that had once held wine, blessed by the priests of the Most High God. He filled it to the brim with the finest vintage from his royal cellars, the red wine dark as blood in the sacred cup. "To Marduk, chief of our gods," he cried, raising the goblet high, "who gives us victory over all our enemies." The assembled throng raised their own sacred vessels, taken from the very altar of the Lord. "To Marduk," they chorused, their voices echoing off the marble walls. But Belshazzar was not content with honouring just one deity. As the evening progressed and the wine continued to flow, he led toast after toast, each one more blasphemous than the last. "To the gods of gold," he proclaimed, and the crowd drank deeply from vessels that had once held the showbread of the temple. "To the gods of silver," he continued, as goblets that had caught the blood of sacrifices now brimmed with Babylonian wine. "To the gods of bronze and iron," the king shouted, his voice growing hoarser with each proclamation. "To the gods of wood and stone, who have made Babylon the greatest empire the world has ever seen." With each toast the revelry grew wilder, the laughter louder, the dancing more frenzied. Noble ladies spun in their silk gowns, their jewellery catching the lamplight as they moved. Men struck up drinking songs, their voices blending in harmony that spoke of triumph and excess. The very air seemed thick with incense and wine fumes, creating an atmosphere of decadent celebration. But high above the palace, in the courts of heaven, other eyes watched this display of pride and blasphemy. The sacred vessels, fashioned for the worship of the one true God, profaned by lips that praised idols of metal and wood. The moment had come for divine justice to make itself known upon the earth. It was in the midst of the wildest revelry, as the feast reached its crescendo of blasphemous celebration, that the atmosphere in the great hall began to change. At first it was subtle, a gradual shift that few noticed amid the chaos of music and laughter. The temperature seemed to drop slightly, though the braziers still burned brightly, and the press of bodies should have kept the air warm. A strange stillness crept into the room, not the absence of sound, but something deeper, as if the very air had grown heavy with an unseen presence. King Belshazzar stood near his throne, swaying slightly from the effects of wine, his golden goblet raised in yet another toast to the gods of Babylon. His nobles surrounded him, their faces flushed with drink and excitement, sacred vessels clutched in their hands as they prepared to echo their sovereign's words. The musicians played with passionate intensity, their instruments weaving melodies that spoke of earthly glory and endless prosperity. And then, in the space of a single heartbeat, everything changed. The music faltered first, not as if the musicians had stopped playing, but as if the very air had grown too thick to carry their melodies. Conversations died mid-sentence, laughter cut off as abruptly as if severed by a blade. Even the flickering flames of the lamps seemed to burn lower, their light growing dim and uncertain. It was then that someone screamed. The cry came from a noble woman near the eastern wall, her voice sharp with terror as her trembling finger pointed upward. Every head in the vast hall turned to follow her gaze, and what they saw there drove the colour from their faces and the strength from their limbs. There, upon the wall directly opposite the king's throne, a human hand had appeared, not attached to any arm or body, but suspended in the air as if emerging from the very substance of eternity itself. The hand was illuminated by its own light, pale and ghostly, yet undeniably real, casting shadows that danced across the painted murals of Babylonian gods. The fingers were long and elegant, neither young nor old, but possessed of a timeless quality that spoke of power beyond human understanding. They moved with deliberate precision, as if guided by a will that brooked no resistance, no hesitation. And as the assembled throng watched in growing horror, those fingers began to write. The writing appeared as lines of fire upon the polished marble, each character burning itself into the stone with the permanence of divine judgment. The script was unlike any earthly language, neither Babylonian cuneiform nor Hebrew letters, but something older and more fundamental, as if the very essence of meaning was being carved directly into reality itself. King Belshazzar felt his knees begin to shake, his golden goblet slipping from nerveless fingers to shatter upon the floor. The sacred vessel that moments before had held wine, offered in mockery to false gods, now lay broken, its precious contents spreading like blood across the marble. His face, so recently flushed with wine and arrogance, had gone pale as death, his eyes wide with a terror he had never before experienced. The hand continued its work, unmoved by the chaos it had caused in the hall below. Characters appeared one after another, each one blazing within a fire before settling into a steady glow that seemed to penetrate the very souls of all who looked upon it. The writing was clear and bold, demanding attention, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Around the hall, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Some of the nobles had fallen to their knees, whether from terror or instinctive reverence, it was impossible to say. Others pressed against the walls, as if trying to escape through solid stone, their eyes never leaving the supernatural display before them. The sacred vessels of Solomon's temple lay scattered across the floor, abandoned by hands that now trembled too violently to hold them. The musicians had long since set down their instruments, their faces pale masks of fear. Servants cowered in doorways, torn between the desire to flee and their duty to remain. The dancing girls who moments before had spun and laughed now stood frozen like statues, their silk scarves trailing forgotten around their feet. But it was upon King Belshazzar that the greatest terror fell, as the ruler who had ordered the profanation of the sacred vessels, as the one who had led the blasphemous toasts. He felt the weight of divine displeasure focusing upon him like the heat of a burning glass. His crown, so recently a symbol of earthly power, now felt heavy as lead upon his brow. His royal robes, dyed in the finest purples and blues, seemed to hang upon him like grave clothes. The hand finished its work and faded from view as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the words burning upon the wall like coals of fire. But even in its absence, the presence that had guided it remained, filling the hall with an atmosphere of judgment that made every breath a struggle. Silence reigned in the great banquet hall of Babylon, broken only by the occasional sob or whispered prayer. The greatest feast in the empire's history had become a scene of terror and divine revelation, and upon the wall, where gods and heroes had been painted in their imagined glory, 4 words now blazed with the fire of heaven's judgment. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. In the awful silence that followed the hand's disappearance, King Belshazzar stood transfixed, his gaze locked upon the burning words that seemed to sear themselves deeper into his consciousness with each passing moment. The weight of divine judgment pressed down upon the hall like a physical force, and the king's breath came in short, sharp gasps, as if the very air had grown too thin to sustain life. Gradually, as the initial shock began to wear off, the practical reality of the situation asserted itself. Here were words written by a supernatural hand, clearly intended as some form of message or warning, but their meaning remained utterly mysterious. The script was unlike anything in the libraries of Babylon, the characters seeming to shift and dance, even as they maintained their fixed positions upon the wall. "The wise men," Belshazzar managed to croak, his voice barely recognisable. "Summon all the wise men of Babylon, every magician, every astrologer, every diviner in the city. Bring them here at once." His command galvanised the paralysed servants into action. They scattered like leaves before a wind, grateful for any excuse to leave the presence of those terrifying words. Throughout the palace and into the city they ran, pounding upon doors and rousing from sleep the learned men whose wisdom had served the empire for generations. The first to arrive were the court magicians, men whose elaborate robes and mystical instruments had earned them places of honour at royal ceremonies. They entered the banquet hall with confidence, their heads held high and their voices ready with the usual formulas of greeting and flattery. But one look at the writing upon the wall, one glimpse of those characters that seemed to burn within a fire, and their confidence evaporated like mist before the sun. They approached the wall cautiously, their heads tilted at various angles as they studied the mysterious script. They consulted ancient tablets and scrolls, compared the characters to every known form of writing, whispered incantations and cast lots according to their various arts. But though they laboured long into the night, turning the problem over from every conceivable angle, they could make no sense of the divine message. The astrologers came next, men who claimed to read the future in the movements of stars and planets. They examined the writing with instruments of bronze and silver, measuring the angles and proportions of each character as if they were constellations written across the heavens. They calculated and computed, referenced their star charts, and consulted their ancient tables, but the meaning of the words remained as hidden as the dark side of the moon. As the hours passed, more and more of Babylon's learned men arrived at the palace, priests of Marduk and Ishtar, scholars who had studied in the great libraries, men whose reputations for wisdom extended throughout the known world. Each group brought their own methods and their own certainty that they would succeed where others had failed. Yet one by one, they too were forced to admit defeat before the mystery of the burning words. King Belshazzar grew increasingly desperate as each attempt failed. He paced before his throne like a caged lion, his robes dishevelled, and his crown askew. The sacred vessels of Solomon's temple lay scattered and forgotten across the floor, their golden surfaces reflecting the supernatural light from the wall in fractured gleams that hurt the eyes to look upon. "Gold," the king proclaimed suddenly, his voice cracking with strain. "I will give gold beyond counting to whoever can read these words. Silver and precious stones, lands and titles, whatever they desire shall be theirs." But even the promise of unlimited wealth could not unlock the meaning of heaven's message. The wise men huddled together in small groups, whispering their theories and hypotheses, but none dared claim understanding of what clearly lay beyond human comprehension. It was then, as the night wore on toward dawn and desperation reached its peak, that a new figure entered the banquet hall. She was an elderly woman, her hair white as snow, but her back still straight and her eyes bright with intelligence. This was Nitocris, the Queen Mother, widow of Nebuchadnezzar and grandmother to Belshazzar himself. She had heard the commotion from her private quarters, had seen the servants running through the corridors, and felt the strange oppression that seemed to hang over the entire palace. Now she made her way through the crowd of baffled wise men, her presence commanding respect even in the midst of chaos. "My Lord King," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, despite her advanced years. "I see that you are troubled, that the colour has left your face and your limbs shake with fear. Do not let your thoughts alarm you, and do not look so pale." Belshazzar turned toward her, her hope flickering in his eyes like a candle flame in a dark room. "Grandmother, you have seen much in your long life. You were wife to great Nebuchadnezzar. You know the secrets of the empire. Can you tell me what these words mean?" The Queen Mother approached the wall, studying the burning characters with the careful attention of one who had witnessed many supernatural events during her husband's reign. "I cannot read these words, my grandson," she said at length, "but I know of one who might." She turned back to face the assembly, her aged voice somehow carrying more authority than all the learned men combined. "There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your grandfather, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. King Nebuchadnezzar appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers." A murmur ran through the crowd at these words. Many of the older nobles remembered stories from Nebuchadnezzar's time, tales of a Hebrew exile who had interpreted dreams and solved mysteries that baffled all others. But in the years since the great king's death, this man had faded from prominence, forgotten in the new reign's focus on younger advisers. "This man Daniel," the Queen Mother continued, "whom the king named Belteshazzar, has an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems. Let Daniel be called, and he will tell you what the writing means." As the name Daniel echoed through the hall, Belshazzar felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. He had heard the stories, knew of the Hebrews' reputation for wisdom and divine favour, but he also knew that Daniel had served his grandfather faithfully, and might not be inclined to help the king who had dishonoured the vessels of his people's God. Nevertheless, desperation overcame pride, and Belshazzar gave the command, "Find Daniel the Hebrew, bring him here immediately. If he can read these words, he shall be clothed in purple, and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." As servants rushed to obey this new command, the burning words continued to glow upon the wall, patient as eternity, waiting for the one who had been chosen to unlock their meaning and pronounce the doom of Babylon. The dawn was breaking over Babylon when Daniel arrived at the palace, summoned from sleep by urgent messengers, who spoke in hushed, fearful tones of supernatural writing and royal desperation. He was an old man now, his beard white with age and his face marked by the lines of many years spent in faithful service to foreign kings. yet his eyes remained clear and bright, reflecting a wisdom that came not from human learning, but from communion with the eternal God. As he entered the banquet hall, Daniel paused for a moment to take in the scene before him. The remnants of the great feast lay scattered about like the debris of a broken dream. Golden plates and silver cups, many of them the sacred vessels of Solomon's temple, littered the floor, among pools of spilled wine and trampled delicacies. The nobles who had revelled so wildly just hours before now stood in small frightened groups, their fine clothes dishevelled and their faces pale with terror. But it was the writing upon the wall that commanded his attention, those 4 words blazing with divine fire that no earthly wisdom could extinguish. Daniel looked upon them without fear, for he recognised the hand that had written them, and he understood that he stood in the presence of the Almighty's judgment. King Belshazzar approached him with hasty, desperate steps, his royal dignity forgotten in his need for answers. "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, whom my grandfather the king brought from Judah?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I have heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you." The king gestured toward the wall with a trembling hand. "Now the wise men and enchanters have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom." Daniel listened to these promises of wealth and power with the patience of one who had seen empires rise and fall, who had served in the courts of kings and understood the vanity of earthly honours. When Belshazzar finished speaking, the old prophet's response came with quiet authority that somehow filled the vast hall more completely than the king's desperate entreaties. "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another," Daniel said, his voice calm and steady in the face of royal panic. "Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." But before he would interpret the supernatural message, Daniel had words of his own to speak, words that cut to the heart of the night's blasphemous revelry, and laid bare the spiritual rebellion that had brought divine judgment upon Babylon. "O king," he began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, "the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather, kingship, and greatness, and glory, and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled." The assembled nobles listened in growing discomfort as Daniel recounted the story they all knew but preferred to forget. Nebuchadnezzar's pride, his claim to have built Babylon by his own power and for his own glory, and the terrible judgment that followed. How the great king had been driven from among men to live like a beast in the wilderness, eating grass like an ox, and letting his hair grow long as eagle's feathers and his nails like birds' claws. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, Daniel continued, his eyes never leaving Belshazzar's face, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind, and sets over it whom he will. The silence in the hall was absolute as Daniel paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the hearts of all who heard them. Then with the authority of one who spoke for the God of heaven, he delivered his devastating rebuke. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, he declared, his voice now ringing with prophetic power. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways you have not honoured. Each word fell upon the assembled company like blows from a hammer, shattering their illusions of security and exposing the full extent of their rebellion against the Most High. Belshazzar himself seemed to shrink before Daniel's accusing words, his royal robes hanging loose about his diminished frame, his crown sitting askew upon a head bowed with shame and terror. The sacred vessels lay scattered around the hall like silent witnesses to the truth of Daniel's words. These cups and bowls, crafted for the worship of the one true God, had been defiled by lips that praised idols of metal and stone. The wine that had flowed so freely in blasphemous toasts now seemed to accuse those who had drunk it, its red stains upon the marble floor like drops of blood that cried out for justice. Then from his presence the hand was sent, Daniel concluded, pointing toward the burning words upon the wall, and this writing was inscribed. The hall remained wrapped in profound silence, as all waited to hear the interpretation that would seal Babylon's fate. The wise men who had laboured through the night stood humbled before this Hebrew exile who had succeeded where they had failed. The nobles who had revelled in their blasphemy now cowered before the prospect of divine judgment. And King Belshazzar, who had thought himself secure in his power, waited to hear the doom that had been written by the finger of God upon his palace wall. Daniel turned from the cowering king to face the wall where the divine words blazed with undiminished fire. The characters seemed to pulse within a light, each one carrying the weight of heaven's judgment and the certainty of prophetic fulfillment. In the profound silence of the great hall, the aged prophet lifted his voice and began to speak the words that would seal the fate of the Babylonian Empire. "And this is the writing that was inscribed," Daniel announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. "Many, many tekel and parsin." He paused, allowing the strange words to echo through the hall, their sounds somehow both foreign and familiar, like a half-remembered dream that carries portents of future sorrow. The assembled nobles leaned forward despite their fear, desperate to understand the message that had struck such terror into their hearts. "This is the interpretation of the matter," Daniel continued, his aged voice gaining strength as he spoke for the God of heaven. "Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end." The first word fell upon the assembly like a death sentence. Here was the divine accountant taking inventory of Belshazzar's reign, counting each day of blasphemy and rebellion, each moment of pride and defiance against the Most High. The king's face went even paler, if such a thing were possible, and several of the nobles gasped aloud at the finality of the pronouncement. But Daniel was not finished. The second judgment followed hard upon the first, each word a hammer blow against the foundations of Babylonian pride. "Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting." Here was the divine judge placing Belshazzar's reign, his character, his very soul, upon the perfect scales of heaven's justice. And the verdict was damning beyond appeal. Found wanting, found lacking, found insufficient when measured against the standards of righteousness and truth. The king, who had thought himself great in his own eyes, was revealed to be nothing more than a feather in the balance when weighed against divine holiness. Belshazzar's knees gave way completely at these words. and he would have fallen had not 2 of his guards stepped forward to support him. The golden crown tumbled from his head to ring against the marble floor, the sound echoing through the hall like a funeral bell. His royal robes, so recently symbols of power and majesty, now seemed to hang upon him like burial shrouds. Peres, Daniel proclaimed, using the singular form of the final word, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The last judgment was perhaps the most terrible of all, for it spoke not merely of the king's personal doom, but of the end of the empire itself. Babylon, the golden head of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the city that had ruled the world with rod of iron, was to be divided like a carcass among its enemies. The Medes and Persians, even now camped outside the city walls, would soon walk through its gates as conquerors and claim its treasures as their own. A wail of despair went up from some of the assembled nobles as the full weight of the prophecy struck home. They had thought themselves secure behind Babylon's mighty walls, protected by their gods and their armies from any earthly threat. But now they understood that their true enemy was not the Persian host outside their gates, but the God of heaven himself, against whom no wall could stand and no army could prevail. Daniel stood unmoved amid the chaos of fear and lamentation, his weathered face reflecting the sorrow of one who took no pleasure in the pronouncement of judgment, yet understood its necessity. He had served this empire faithfully for decades, had helped to interpret its dreams and solve its mysteries, but he had also watched its gradual descent into pride and blasphemy, its increasing defiance of the God who held its breath in his hands. The Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, he said, his voice cutting through the din of panic and despair. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. These words, drawn from his own experience of divine revelation, served as both comfort and warning to all who heard them. Comfort to those who trusted in the sovereign God, for they could be assured that no earthly power could stand against his ultimate purposes, but warning to those who set themselves against heaven's will, for they would surely be brought low in their appointed time. King Belshazzar, supported now by his guards and struggling to maintain even a semblance of royal dignity, looked up at Daniel with eyes haunted by the certainty of doom. Yet even in his extremity, he sought to honour his promise to the man who had solved the mystery that had baffled all his wise men. "Clothe Daniel with purple," he commanded, in a voice barely above a whisper, "and put a chain of gold around his neck, and proclaim that he shall be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom." It was a pathetic gesture, the dying king attempting to bestow honours, even as his kingdom crumbled around him. The purple robe was brought, the golden chain placed around Daniel's neck, but these earthly symbols of power seemed hollow and meaningless in the face of the divine judgment that had been pronounced. Daniel accepted the honours not for their own sake, but as a testimony to the truth of his words. When the people saw that the king himself acknowledged the accuracy of the Hebrew prophet's interpretation, they would know that the doom of Babylon was certain and that the God of Israel was indeed sovereign over all earthly kingdoms. As the purple robes settled around Daniel's aged shoulders, and the golden chain caught the light of the supernatural writing on the wall, the contrast could not have been more stark. Here stood a man clothed with earthly honours, yet serving a heavenly king, while around him an empire clothed in pride and blasphemy faced its final hour of judgment. The words on the wall continued to burn with undiminished intensity, their message now fully revealed but their power unabated. They served as a permanent reminder that the kingdoms of this world are temporary, subject to the sovereign will of the God who numbers their days and weighs their deeds in the balance of perfect justice. even as Daniel spoke his interpretation and received the hollow honours of a doomed king, the wheels of divine judgment were already turning beyond the palace walls. For months, the Persian army under Cyrus had maintained their siege of the great city, but the Babylonians had felt secure behind walls that had never been breached by any earthly foe. They had provisions to last for years, abundant water from the Euphrates River, and an unshakable confidence in the strength of their defences. But on this night, as supernatural writing blazed upon the palace wall and prophecy sealed the empire's fate, Cyrus was putting into motion a plan of breathtaking audacity that would prove that no human fortress can stand against the purposes of the Almighty. The Euphrates River, which flowed through the heart of Babylon and provided both water and transportation for the great city, was also its greatest vulnerability. The river entered the city through massive gates that could be lowered into the water, and it flowed beneath the walls through channels that were thought to be too narrow and well defended for any army to use as an entrance. But Cyrus had spent months studying these defences, and his engineers had been working tirelessly upstream from the city, digging channels and building dams that would allow them to divert the mighty river from its course. The work had been done quietly, secretly, hidden from Babylonian scouts by the darkness of night and the cleverness of Persian engineering. As the banquet hall erupted in chaos at Daniel's interpretation, as nobles fled in terror and servants cowered in corners, the Persian engineers upstream were opening their carefully constructed channels. The waters of the Euphrates, which had flowed through Babylon for centuries, began to turn aside into the new channels that Cyrus had prepared. At first the change was barely noticeable. The river level dropped slowly, gradually, as if affected by nothing more than seasonal variations. But as more water was diverted, as the new channels carried away the river's flow, the level within the city began to drop significantly. By midnight, Persian soldiers were wading through knee-deep water where once the river had flowed deep and strong. They moved silently through the darkness, following the riverbed beneath the great walls of Babylon, their weapons wrapped in cloth to prevent any sound that might alert the guards above. The Babylonian sentries, focused on watching for attacks against the massive gates and towering walls, never thought to look down at the river that had always been their protection. They were drunk on wine from the royal feast, their attention scattered by the strange reports of supernatural writing in the palace, their confidence unshaken by any thought that their impregnable city could fall in a single night. The first Persian soldiers emerged from the river channels near the heart of the city, just as Daniel finished pronouncing his interpretation. While the prophet spoke of kingdoms divided and given to the Medes and Persians, those very conquerors were already inside Babylon's walls, moving swiftly through streets where citizens slept peacefully, unaware that their empire was breathing its last. The palace guards, those few who remained at their posts while most had crowded into the banquet hall to witness the supernatural spectacle, were overwhelmed before they could raise an alarm. Persian steel, sharp and silent in the darkness, found its mark with deadly efficiency. Within minutes, the palace was secured, its approaches controlled by Cyrus's elite troops. In the banquet hall, King Belshazzar was still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his doom when the great doors burst open and Persian soldiers poured into the room. The nobles, already terrified by the supernatural writing and Daniel's interpretation, now faced the earthly fulfillment of heaven's judgment. Some tried to flee, but found every exit blocked by armed men. Others fell to their knees, begging for mercy that would not come. The sacred vessels of Solomon's temple, scattered across the floor where they had been dropped in blasphemous revelry, now reflected the gleam of Persian bronze and steel in their golden surfaces. Belshazzar himself stood frozen for a moment, the weight of prophecy and the reality of conquest crashing together in his mind like colliding worlds. The writing on the wall blazed with undiminished fire, its message now fulfilled before his very eyes. The Medes and Persians had indeed inherited his kingdom, just as the divine hand had written and Daniel had interpreted. The end came swiftly. Persian soldiers, their orders clear and their duty unwavering, moved through the hall with grim efficiency. King Belshazzar, the ruler who had mocked the God of heaven and profaned his holy vessels, fell beneath Persian swords before the night was through. The golden crown that had tumbled from his head lay forgotten on the marble floor, while his blood mingled with the spilled wine from the sacred goblets. Throughout the great city, the same scene was repeated. Persian forces, having entered through the river channels, swept through Babylon like an irresistible tide. The gates were opened from within, the walls manned by conquerors rather than defenders, the mighty empire brought to its knees in a single night of divine judgment. By dawn, Cyrus's standards flew from the towers of Babylon, and Darius the Mede had been installed as the new ruler of the greatest city in the world. The empire that had seemed eternal, the walls that had appeared impregnable, the power that had dominated the known world for generations, all had fallen before the sovereign will of the God who rules in the kingdoms of men. As the sun rose over conquered Babylon, painting the great city in shades of gold and crimson that seemed somehow fitting for its fall, Daniel stood again before the wall where the supernatural writing continued to glow with divine fire. The banquet hall was empty now, save for the debris of the feast and the silent testimony of judgment fulfilled. Mina, Tekel, Parsin, the words that had sealed an empire's fate, now served as an eternal reminder of truths that transcend the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms. God had indeed numbered the days of Belshazzar's reign and brought it to an end. The king had been weighed in heaven's perfect scales and found wanting. The kingdom had been divided and given to the Medes and Persians, just as the supernatural hand had written and the faithful prophet had interpreted. The sacred vessels of Solomon's temple, once profaned by blasphemous lips, would soon be restored to their proper place of honour. Under Cyrus's benevolent rule, the Jewish exiles would be free to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, carrying with them the golden cups and silver bowls that had witnessed both the depths of human pride and the certainty of divine justice. Daniel himself, now clothed in the purple of a dying empire, yet serving the eternal kingdom of heaven, had once again demonstrated that those who trust in the Most High God will never be disappointed. Through him, the sovereignty of the Almighty had been proclaimed in the halls of earthly power, and the vanity of human pride had been exposed for all to see. The lesson of that terrible night echoes through the corridors of history, speaking to every generation that dares to lift itself up against the Lord of heaven. Kingdoms rise and fall like waves upon the shore. Empires that seem eternal prove to be as fleeting as morning mist, but the kingdom of God endures forever. No wall can stand against his purposes, no power can resist his will, no pride can escape his judgment. In our own age, when earthly kingdoms still vie for dominion and human pride still challenges heaven's authority, the writing on Babylon's wall remains as relevant as ever. We who read these ancient words would do well to remember that the God who humbled Nebuchadnezzar, who numbered Belshazzar's days, who gave Babylon to the Medes and Persians, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The scales of divine justice still weigh the actions of nations and individuals. The sovereign hand that writes the destiny of empires still guides the course of human history, and the kingdom that Daniel served, the kingdom that outlasted Babylon and Persia and all the empires that followed, remains the only power that will never pass away. As night falls once again over the ancient site where Babylon once stood in all its glory, as stars appear in the darkness above ruins that once housed the pride of earthly kingdoms. The eternal truth, proclaimed by that supernatural hand, continues to shine with undiminished light. The Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and blessed are those who humble themselves before his throne. May we who hear this ancient story find in it not merely a tale of judgment long past, but a present reminder of the God who sees all, knows all, and judges all with perfect righteousness. And may we, like Daniel, serve faithfully in whatever earthly kingdom we find ourselves, while keeping our ultimate allegiance to the kingdom that cannot be shaken, the kingdom that endures forever and ever. The writing is on the wall, dear friends. The question that remains is whether we will read it in time to humble ourselves before the King of Kings, or whether we will follow Belshazzar's path to destruction. The choice, as always, is ours to make. Hello friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. I hope your day has been filled with blessings, no matter what time you're joining us or where you are in this beautiful world. Before we begin tonight's journey into the remarkable story of Gideon, I want to invite you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber so you never miss these powerful biblical narratives that can transform your heart and strengthen your faith. Now let's settle in as we explore one of the most extraordinary accounts of courage, faith, and divine intervention in all of Scripture. The sun hung low over the hills of Israel, casting long shadows across a land that had once flowed with milk and honey. But those days seemed like distant memories now. The once prosperous nation had fallen into chaos, its people scattered and hiding like frightened animals. For 7 long years, the Midianites had swept down upon Israel like locusts, devouring everything in their path. Picture, if you will, the terror that gripped every village and farmstead. Families would wake each morning not knowing if this would be the day the raiders would come. Fathers would venture out to check their crops, only to find them trampled and stolen. Children would be hushed to silence at the first sound of hoofbeats on the horizon. The very air seemed thick with fear and desperation. The Midianites, along with their allies, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples, had turned the conquest of Israel into an annual ritual. Like a plague of locusts, they would arrive at harvest time, their camels beyond counting, stretching across the landscape as far as the eye could see. They would strip the land bare, taking not only the grain and livestock, but also crushing the spirits of God's chosen people. Farmers had abandoned their fields, choosing instead to hide in mountain caves and underground chambers. The marketplaces that once bustled with commerce now stood empty and silent. What should have been a time of celebration and thanksgiving for the harvest had become a season of dread and starvation. Israel's cities, once proud and strong, had crumbled into mere shadows of their former glory. The walls that should have protected the people lay in ruins, and the gates that once welcomed travellers now hung broken on their hinges. It was as if the very blessing of God had departed from the land, leaving behind only sorrow and defeat. In this atmosphere of despair, mothers would gather their children close and whisper the old stories of how God had delivered their ancestors from Egypt, how he had parted the Red Sea and given them victory over mighty enemies. But those stories seemed like fairy tales now, beautiful but impossible dreams from a time when God still cared about his people. The elders of Israel shook their heads in bewilderment. Where was the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob? Where was the mighty deliverer who had once fought for them? Had he forgotten his covenant? Had he abandoned them to their enemies forever? It was into this world of darkness and desperation that our story begins, in the small town of Ophrah, where a young man named Gideon was about to discover that God had not forgotten his people, after all. But Gideon, like so many others, had lost hope. He had watched his family's livelihood disappear year after year, and he had grown tired of empty promises and unanswered prayers. On this particular day, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, both literally and figuratively, Gideon was engaged in the dangerous work of threshing wheat. But he wasn't doing it in the traditional threshing floor, where the grain could be properly separated from the chaff by the wind. Instead, he was hidden away in a wine press, a place where grapes were normally crushed to make wine. It was cramped, inefficient, and poorly ventilated, but it offered something more valuable than convenience. It offered concealment from enemy eyes. As Gideon worked in his makeshift hiding place, sweat dripping from his brow in the confined space, he embodied the broken spirit of his entire nation. Here was a man reduced to secret, fearful labour just to provide basic sustenance for his family. The very act of threshing wheat, once a joyful community celebration, had become a furtive, isolated struggle for survival. Little did Gideon know that this moment of apparent defeat would become the launching pad for one of the most remarkable displays of God's power in human history. The God who seemed absent was actually watching, waiting, and preparing to use this unlikely hero in ways that would astound both friend and foe alike. The rhythm of Gideon's work was steady but tense. Each strike of his flail against the wheat stalks echoed softly in the confined space of the wine press. His eyes darted frequently toward the opening above, watching for any sign of danger. The precious grain he was salvaging represented not just food for today, but hope for tomorrow, assuming the Midianites didn't discover his hiding place. The silence of the afternoon was broken by an unexpected voice. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon's heart nearly stopped. He spun around, flail raised defensively, expecting to see a Midianite scout who had somehow discovered his secret location. Instead, he found himself face to face with a figure unlike any he had ever encountered. The stranger sat calmly beneath the great oak tree that overlooked the wine press, his presence somehow both commanding and peaceful. The greeting struck Gideon as almost mockingly ironic. Mighty warrior? Him? The man who was reduced to threshing wheat in secret, constantly looking over his shoulder in fear. And the Lord is with you? If that were true, then why was Israel suffering under such devastating oppression? "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, his voice heavy with skepticism and pain. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The words poured out of Gideon like water from a broken dam. Years of frustration, disappointment, and unanswered questions came tumbling forth. He had grown up hearing the magnificent stories of God's mighty deeds, of pillars of fire and cloud, of armies defeated and nations subdued. But where was that God now? Where were those miracles when his people needed them most? The stranger listened patiently to Gideon's outburst, showing no offence at the young man's boldness or apparent lack of faith. There was something in his eyes that spoke of ancient wisdom and unlimited compassion. When Gideon finished speaking, the visitor's response was both simple and earth-shattering. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" The audacity of the command took Gideon's breath away. Save Israel? Him? The implications were staggering. This wasn't a request for him to join an army or support a cause. This was a divine commission to personally lead the deliverance of an entire nation from a seemingly impossible situation. "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon stammered, his mind reeling, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Gideon's response revealed the depth of his feelings of inadequacy. In a culture where tribal strength and family position determined social standing and influence, he saw himself as doubly disqualified. His clan held no political power, commanded no great armies, and possessed no significant wealth. Within that already weak clan, he was the youngest, the most inexperienced, the least likely to be chosen for any position of leadership. But the stranger's next words would echo through the ages as one of the most profound promises ever given to a human being. "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." The promise was comprehensive and absolute. Not some of the Midianites, not most of them, but all of them. The victory would be complete and decisive, but more importantly, it would not depend on Gideon's strength, wisdom, or experience. It would depend entirely on the presence and power of God himself. Still struggling to believe what he was hearing, Gideon made a request that would reveal both his desire for faith and his need for certainty. "If now I have found favour in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." The stranger agreed to wait, and Gideon hurried to his house to prepare an offering. His heart raced as he worked, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared a young goat and made bread from an ephah of flour. This was not a small offering by the standards of his time, especially for a family struggling under the oppression of constant raids. Yet something within him compelled him to give generously, to honour this mysterious visitor properly. When Gideon returned with the prepared food, the stranger instructed him to place the meat and unleavened bread on a rock and pour out the broth. Gideon obeyed, though he couldn't understand the purpose of these strange instructions. What happened next would leave no doubt about the supernatural nature of his visitor. The stranger touched the meat and bread with the tip of the staff he carried, and immediately fire flared from the rock, consuming the entire offering in an instant. The flames burned with an intensity and heat that no ordinary fire could match, leaving nothing behind but the memory of their brilliance. In that same moment, the stranger vanished from sight, disappearing as suddenly and mysteriously as he had appeared. Terror gripped Gideon's heart as the full realization of what had just occurred crashed over him like a mighty wave. This had been no ordinary man, no mere messenger or prophet. This had been the angel of the Lord, a manifestation of God himself. In that moment of understanding, Gideon was overwhelmed not with joy, but with mortal fear. "Alas, sovereign Lord," he cried out in anguish, "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." In the ancient world, it was believed that no human could see God and live. The very encounter that should have filled him with confidence instead filled him with terror. Had his boldness in questioning and testing the Lord sealed his doom? Would he die for having stood in the presence of the Almighty? But even in his moment of greatest fear, God's grace reached out to comfort him. The voice of the Lord came to him again, gentle and reassuring. "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." With his own hands, Gideon built an altar on that spot and called it, "The Lord is Peace." The place where he had threshed wheat in fear and desperation had become holy ground, the site of a divine encounter that would change not only his life, but the destiny of an entire nation. As night fell over Ophrah, Gideon stood beside his new altar, his mind swirling with the magnitude of what had occurred. The God of his ancestors had not abandoned Israel after all. He had been working, planning, preparing for this very moment, And somehow, incredibly, he had chosen Gideon to be his instrument of deliverance. Yet even as faith began to bloom in his heart, doubt lingered like shadows at the edges of his mind. The task before him seemed impossible, the odds insurmountable. How could he, one man from the weakest clan in Manasseh, possibly hope to defeat the countless multitudes of Midian and their allies? It was a question that would lead him to make one of the most famous requests for divine confirmation in all of Scripture. The days following Gideon's encounter with the angel of the Lord were filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The divine commissioning had been clear and unmistakable, yet the human heart, prone to doubt and fear, struggled to fully embrace what seemed impossible. Gideon found himself caught between the supernatural certainty of his calling and the natural uncertainties of his circumstances. As he went about his daily tasks, Gideon's mind constantly returned to that moment when fire had consumed his offering and the angel had vanished from sight. Had it really happened? In the bright light of day, with the familiar sounds and sights of ordinary life surrounding him, the encounter almost seemed like a dream. Yet the altar he had built stood as a permanent reminder, its stones bearing witness to the reality of what had occurred. Word began to spread quietly through the region about Gideon's calling. Some believed and were filled with hope for the first time in years. Others were skeptical, wondering how this young man could possibly succeed where so many others had failed. Still others were fearful, worried that any attempt at resistance would only bring more severe retaliation from their oppressors. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Gideon's shoulders. He was being asked not just to risk his own life, but potentially to lead others to their deaths. What if he had misunderstood? What if his faith had somehow led him astray? The consequences of a mistake would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for all who would follow him. It was in this state of mind that Gideon made his famous request for divine confirmation. The fleece test, as it would come to be known, represented not a lack of faith, but rather a deep desire for certainty in the face of overwhelming responsibility. "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised," Gideon prayed earnestly, "look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." The request was specific and measurable. In the normal course of nature, dew would form on all surfaces exposed to the night air. If God could reverse this natural process, causing moisture to collect only on the fleece, while leaving the surrounding ground completely dry, it would serve as an unmistakable sign of divine intervention. Gideon placed the fleece carefully on the threshing floor as evening approached. All through the night he must have awakened periodically, wondering what he would find in the morning. As dawn broke, he hurried to the spot where he had placed his test. What he discovered filled him with wonder and awe. The fleece was thoroughly saturated with dew, so much so that when he wrung it out, he was able to fill an entire bowl with water. Yet all around it, the ground was completely dry, as if an invisible barrier had prevented any moisture from settling anywhere but on the wool. The sign was clear and unmistakable, yet Gideon's human nature craved even greater certainty. The magnitude of what he was being called to do seemed to justify asking for additional confirmation. With remarkable humility and boldness he approached God with yet another request. "Do not be angry with me," Gideon prayed, acknowledging that his repeated testing might seem to indicate a lack of trust. "Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." This second test was even more remarkable than the first. It would be one thing for God to cause dew to collect on a single object, while keeping the surrounding area dry. but it would be quite another to keep one small piece of wool completely dry while saturating everything around it. This second sign would demonstrate not just God's power over nature, but his precise control over the smallest details. Again, Gideon placed the fleece on the threshing floor and waited through the night. When morning came, he found exactly what he had requested. The fleece was bone dry without a trace of moisture, while the ground all around it sparkled with heavy dew. The grass, the stones, the nearby trees, everything was wet with the night's moisture, except for that one small piece of wool. God had patiently granted both requests, demonstrating not anger at Gideon's need for reassurance, but understanding and compassion for human weakness. The fleece tests revealed important truths about the nature of faith and the character of God. Faith is not the absence of questions or doubts. Rather, it is the willingness to act in obedience despite those questions and doubts. Moreover, God's response to Gideon's requests showed his patience with those who seek him earnestly. He did not rebuke Gideon for his need for confirmation, nor did he withdraw his calling because of the young man's hesitation. Instead, he graciously provided the assurance that Gideon needed to step forward in faith. The fleece tests also demonstrated the balance between seeking divine guidance and taking action. There comes a point when further testing can become an excuse for inaction, when the desire for certainty becomes a barrier to obedience. Gideon wisely limited his requests to 2 clear signs, then proceeded to act on what he had received. As news of these miraculous signs spread throughout the tribes of Israel, hope began to stir in hearts that had been dormant for years. Perhaps God had not forgotten them after all. Perhaps deliverance was indeed coming through this unlikely young man from Ophrah. But before Gideon could lead Israel into battle against their oppressors, he would need to assemble an army. The call went out throughout the territories of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Men who had been hiding in caves and mountain strongholds began to emerge, drawn by the promise of freedom and the reports of God's miraculous confirmations. The response was overwhelming. 32,000 men answered the call, a substantial army by any measure. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers and craftsmen, fathers and sons, united by their hatred of oppression and their desperate hope for liberation. They came carrying whatever weapons they could find, swords that had been hidden from enemy raids, spears hastily fashioned from farming tools, bows that had been used for hunting game in the wilderness. As Gideon looked out over this vast assembly of volunteers, he might have felt a surge of confidence. Surely with 32,000 men, even amateur fighters, he could mount a credible challenge to the Midianite forces. The odds were still daunting, given that the enemy could field armies many times larger, but at least now they had a fighting chance. Yet God had other plans. The fleece tests had been preparation not just for Gideon's faith, but for an even greater demonstration of divine power. The true test was not whether Gideon could trust God with impossible signs, but whether he could trust God with an impossible strategy. What happened next would shock both Gideon and his army, challenging every human assumption about warfare and victory. God was about to demonstrate that his ways are not our ways, and that his power is made perfect, not in human strength, but in human weakness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp as 32,000 men prepared for what they believed would be their march to war. Weapons were sharpened, provisions were packed, and final prayers were offered. The air buzzed with nervous energy as farmers turned warriors contemplated the battle that lay ahead. Gideon moved among his troops, offering words of encouragement and trying to project the confidence that a leader must display. Yet privately, he was still awed by the magnitude of what was happening. Just weeks earlier, he had been hiding in a wine press, and now he stood at the head of the largest volunteer army Israel had assembled in generations. But as the army prepared to march toward the enemy encampment, God spoke to Gideon with words that must have sent shockwaves through his entire being. "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. Our own strength has saved us." Too many men? The statement seemed to defy all military logic. The Midianites and their allies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their camels alone described as being like locusts for multitude. How could 32,000 possibly be considered too many? Yet God's reasoning revealed a profound truth about the nature of divine deliverance. If Israel won the coming battle through conventional military means, they would inevitably credit their victory to their own strength, strategy, and courage. The victory needed to be so obviously supernatural that no one could mistake its source. God's glory was at stake, and that glory could not be shared with human pride. Following God's instructions, Gideon stood before his assembled army and made an announcement that must have stunned many of the volunteers. Anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. The offer was based on an ancient law found in Deuteronomy, which recognised that fearful soldiers could spread panic through the ranks and actually weaken an army's effectiveness. But in this case, the dismissal served a different purpose entirely. God was beginning the process of reducing the army to a size that would make his intervention unmistakable. The response to Gideon's announcement was immediate and devastating. 22,000 men took advantage of the opportunity to withdraw from what many probably saw as a suicide mission anyway. These were not cowards in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people facing an extraordinary situation, and they chose the safety of their families over the uncertainties of battle. As Gideon watched more than 2/3 of his army walk away, his heart must have sunk. 10,000 men remained, still a respectable force, but far fewer than what seemed necessary for the task ahead. Surely now they could proceed with God's blessing. But God was not finished with his reductions. "There are still too many men," came the divine word. "Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go. But if I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." The instruction was puzzling and specific. Gideon was to observe how the men drank water and select his final army based on their drinking method. Of all the criteria that might be used to choose warriors, how they consumed water seemed among the least relevant to military prowess. At the water's edge, the 10,000 men revealed their character through their approach to drinking. The vast majority knelt down and put their faces directly to the water, drinking deeply and focusing entirely on satisfying their thirst. But a small group, only 300 men, demonstrated a different approach. They brought water to their mouths with their hands, lapping it like dogs while maintaining their vigilance and readiness. God's instruction was clear. "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." The reduction was complete and shocking. From 32,000 to 300 represented a decrease of more than 99%. What had begun as a substantial army was now reduced to little more than a large company. The odds, already daunting, had become mathematically absurd. Yet the selection criteria revealed profound spiritual truths. The 300 men who were chosen had demonstrated alertness, self-discipline, and readiness, even in a moment of personal need. While drinking, they had maintained their awareness of their surroundings, prepared for action at a moment's notice. These qualities, while admirable in soldiers, were really symbols of spiritual preparedness and faithfulness. As the dismissed soldiers departed, taking most of the weapons and supplies with them, Gideon was left with 300 men who looked more like a ceremonial guard than a fighting force. The enemy they faced was described in terms that emphasized their overwhelming numbers. All the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. The disparity was so extreme that it moved beyond the realm of military strategy into the realm of the miraculous. No human commander would voluntarily reduce his forces to such a level when facing such overwhelming odds. Yet this was precisely God's point. The victory that was coming would be so clearly divine in origin that no one could attribute it to human planning or prowess. For Gideon, this final reduction must have been the ultimate test of faith. Everything in his military thinking, everything in his natural instincts, everything in conventional wisdom screamed against such a strategy. Yet his experiences with the fleece had prepared him for this moment. He had learned to trust God's ways even when they contradicted human logic. The 300 men who remained showed remarkable faith as well. They could see the enemy forces spread across the valley below them. They knew the odds better than anyone, yet they chose to stay, to trust in the God who had called them through his servant Gideon. As night fell over the Israelite camp, the 300 men prepared for what would be the most unconventional battle in military history. They had no idea that they were about to participate in a victory that would be remembered and celebrated for thousands of years. A victory that would demonstrate God's power to use the weak to confound the mighty. The stage was set for a night that would change everything. The Midianites slept in their countless tents, confident in their overwhelming superiority. The 300 Israelites made their final preparations, trusting in a God who specialized in impossible victories. The hours before dawn are often the darkest, both literally and figuratively. As Gideon and his 300 men crouched in the hills overlooking the vast enemy encampment, the weight of their impossible mission pressed down upon them like a physical burden. The valley below was filled with the tents of their enemies, stretching as far as the eye could see in the starlight, a sea of canvas that housed an army larger than any they had ever faced. Despite the miraculous signs he had witnessed and the divine assurances he had received, Gideon still struggled with doubt. God, in his infinite understanding of human nature, provided one more confirmation before the battle commenced. "Get up, go down against the camp," the Lord instructed, "because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." The offer revealed God's compassionate understanding of Gideon's anxiety. Rather than rebuking him for his continued fears, the Lord provided an opportunity for reassurance. Taking his servant Purah with him, Gideon crept down toward the perimeter of the enemy camp under cover of darkness. The Midianite camp was massive beyond imagination. Thousands upon thousands of tents housed warriors from multiple nations united in their conquest of Israel. The sounds of the sleeping army filled the night air, snoring soldiers, restless camels, the occasional challenge of sentries. The very scale of the enemy forces should have been overwhelming to any reasonable observer. As Gideon and Purah approached the outer edge of the camp, they overheard a conversation between two Midianite soldiers. One was telling his companion about a disturbing dream he had experienced. "I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." The interpretation offered by his fellow soldier was even more remarkable. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. The irony was profound. Here in the heart of the enemy camp, God was providing confirmation through the mouths of Israel's oppressors themselves. The barley bread in the dream was significant. Barley was considered the food of the poor, inferior to wheat. Yet in the dream, this humble loaf had the power to destroy the entire enemy position. The symbolism was clear. God would use the humble and despised to bring down the mighty and proud. That Gideon's name was already known to the enemy indicated that word of the gathering Israelite resistance had reached their ears. Rather than being encouraged by their overwhelming numerical superiority, some among the Midianites were apparently experiencing anxiety about this upstart Hebrew leader. God was already working in the hearts and minds of the enemy, preparing them for defeat. Gideon and Purah retreated to their own lines, hearts pounding with excitement and renewed confidence. The doubt that had plagued Gideon was finally dispelled by this remarkable confirmation. When they reached the Israelite position, Gideon called his men together for final instructions. "Get up," he announced with newfound authority and confidence. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." What followed was perhaps the most unusual battle plan in military history. Instead of swords and spears, Gideon distributed trumpets, empty clay jars, and torches to each of his 300 men. The weapons of conventional warfare were set aside in favour of items that seemed more suited to a religious ceremony than a military campaign. Gideon divided his small force into 3 companies of 100 men each. The strategy was simple, yet audacious. They would surround the enemy camp and at Gideon's signal create as much noise and confusion as possible while giving the appearance of a much larger force. "Watch me," Gideon instructed his men. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" The plan required perfect timing and coordination. Each man would conceal his torch inside a clay jar, maintaining complete darkness and silence until the moment of attack. Then at Gideon's signal, they would simultaneously break their jars, revealing blazing torches, blow their trumpets with all their might, and shout their battle cry. The psychological impact was designed to be devastating. The enemy would suddenly find themselves surrounded by lights and noise, creating the impression of a massive attacking force. In the confusion of a night assault, with limited visibility and the disorientation of being awakened from sleep, even experienced soldiers could panic and lose their sense of direction. As the 3 companies moved into position around the vast perimeter of the enemy camp, each man must have felt the weight of the moment. They were not professional soldiers, but ordinary citizens who had answered the call to fight for their freedom. Now they found themselves in the most critical moment of their lives, armed with the most unconventional weapons imaginable, trusting in a God who had promised victory through seemingly impossible means. The middle watch around midnight was traditionally the time when sentries were changed, and vigilance was often at its lowest point. It was at this precise moment that Gideon and his 100 men reached their assigned position on the edge of the camp. Across the valley, 200 other men waited in similar positions, every eye fixed on their leader for the signal that would begin the battle. Gideon raised his torch-filled jar high above his head, then brought it down sharply, smashing it against a rock. The clay shattered with a sound that seemed to echo across the silent valley, and immediately his torch blazed forth in the darkness. At the same instant, he lifted his trumpet to his lips and blew a long, piercing blast. "For the Lord and for Gideon," he shouted at the top of his lungs. The signal rippled around the camp as 300 jars smashed simultaneously. 300 torches burst into flame, and 300 trumpet heights sounded their defiant call. The battle cry of "For the Lord and for Gideon" echoed from every direction, creating the impression that the Midianite camp was completely surrounded by a massive army. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Thousands of sleeping soldiers were jolted awake to find their camp surrounded by blazing lights and deafening noise. In the confusion and darkness, panic spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers stumbled from their tents, grabbing whatever weapons they could find, unable to determine the size or direction of the attacking force. In their panic and confusion, the Midianites and their allies began attacking each other. Unable to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness, and hearing battle cries in their own languages from every direction, they assumed they had been betrayed by their allies. The coalition that had seemed so formidable began to tear itself apart. The 300 Israelites maintained their positions around the perimeter, continuing to blow their trumpets and hold their torches high, creating the illusion of a massive army that had the enemy completely surrounded. They watched in amazement as God fulfilled his promise in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The panic spread throughout the entire camp like a plague. What had begun as confusion quickly escalated into a full-scale rout as the enemy forces fled in every direction, abandoning their weapons, supplies, and even their camels in their desperate attempt to escape what they perceived as certain destruction. The victory was complete and overwhelming, achieved not through superior numbers or military might, but through divine intervention, working through the obedience of 300 faithful men. The God who had called Gideon from his hiding place in the winepress had once again demonstrated that his power is made perfect in human weakness. As dawn broke over the valley, an astonishing sight greeted the 300 Israelites. Where the night before had stood the mighty encampment of Israel's oppressors, now lay only scattered debris and abandoned supplies. Tents stood empty, their guy ropes cut by fleeing soldiers. Weapons lay discarded where they had fallen from panicked hands. The camels that had been described as innumerable as locusts wandered aimlessly, their owners having fled into the wilderness. The ground itself told the story of the night's chaos. Bloodstains marked the spots where confused allies had struck down one another in the darkness. Personal belongings were strewn across the landscape as the fleeing army had abandoned everything that might slow their escape. The scene looked less like the aftermath of a battle and more like the remnants of a catastrophic natural disaster. Gideon and his men moved through the abandoned camp in wonder, scarcely believing what their eyes were witnessing. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed almost too good to be true. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The army that had terrorized Israel for 7 years had been routed by 300 men armed with trumpets and torches. But God's deliverance was not yet complete. Even as the 300 marvelled at what had occurred in the valley, word of the miraculous victory was spreading throughout the hill country of Israel. Men who had dismissed Gideon's call to arms, who had remained hidden in their caves and strongholds, now emerged with renewed courage and determination. The tribes of Naphtali, Asher and Manasseh rallied to pursue the fleeing Midianites. What had begun with 300 faithful men now swelled into a national movement of liberation. The psychological impact of the victory was as important as the military result. The myth of Midianite invincibility had been shattered in a single night, and the spirit of resistance that had been dormant for so long now burst forth like a river breaking through a dam. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim with urgent instructions. Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them. as far as Beth-barah. This strategic move would cut off the enemy's escape routes and ensure that the victory would be complete. The Ephraimites responded with enthusiasm, capturing the fords of the Jordan and trapping many of the fleeing Midianites. In the pursuit that followed, they captured two of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb, whose names meant raven and wolf. These princes, who had struck terror into Israelite hearts for years, were now defeated and killed at the places that would forever bear their names: the rock of Oreb and the winepress of Zeb. The pursuit continued beyond the Jordan as Gideon and his original 300, though exhausted, pressed on to capture the remaining Midianite kings, Zaba and Zalmunna. The victory was total and decisive. An empire that had dominated the region for 7 years was completely destroyed in a matter of days. The land of Israel enjoyed peace for 40 years during Gideon's lifetime. The oppression that had driven families into hiding was replaced by prosperity and security. Fields that had been abandoned were cultivated again. Markets that had stood empty bustled with commerce. Children who had grown up knowing only fear could now play freely in their villages. But perhaps the greatest victory was not military but spiritual. Israel had rediscovered that their God was still the same mighty deliverer who had brought their ancestors out of Egypt. The impossible victory served as a permanent reminder that with God all things are possible. The story of Gideon and the 300 speaks across the centuries, with timeless truths that challenge and encourage us today. First, we see that God uses the unlikely. Gideon was not a seasoned warrior or a natural leader. He was a fearful farmer, hiding from his enemies. Yet God saw potential that others missed. This reminds us that God's calling is not based on our qualifications, but on his purposes. Second, the reduction of Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300 demonstrates that faith matters more than numbers. In a world obsessed with statistics and metrics, God's economy operates differently. He delights in using small faithful remnants to accomplish great things, ensuring that his power, not human strength, receives the glory. Third, Gideon's requests for signs teach us about the balance between faith and doubt. God was patient with Gideon's need for confirmation, showing us that honest questions and requests for reassurance are not signs of weak faith but of a heart that desires to walk in God's will. Finally, the story shows us that obedience in the face of fear is the essence of courage. Gideon was afraid, his army was outnumbered, and the strategy seemed foolish. Yet they obeyed, and God honoured their faithfulness with victory. When we feel unqualified for the tasks before us, when the odds seem insurmountable, when we need reassurance before taking steps of faith, the story of Gideon reminds us that our God specialises in impossible victories. He is still calling ordinary people to extraordinary purposes, still using the weak to confound the mighty, still turning fearful hearts into faithful warriors. The God who met Gideon at the winepress is the same God who meets us in our hiding places today, calling us to step out in faith and watch him work miracles through surrendered lives. Just as the 300 trumpets and torches became instruments of divine victory, our simple obedience can become the means through which God accomplishes his purposes in our generation. May we have the courage to answer when he calls, the faith to trust when he leads, and the persistence to follow when he sends us into battles that seem impossible to win. For with God, the 300 can defeat the multitudes, and faith can move mountains that seem immovable. The story of Gideon reminds us that our greatest victories come not when we feel strong and capable, but when we acknowledge our weakness and depend completely on God's strength. In those moments of surrender, we discover that we serve a God who delights in doing the impossible through the most unlikely people. And so the story ends where it began, with an invitation to faith, a call to courage, and a promise that the God who delivered Israel through Gideon and the 300 is still delivering his people today, one impossible victory at a time.
Hello dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin this beautiful journey together, I'd love to connect with you for just a moment. How has your day been? Whether it's morning, afternoon or evening where you are in the world, I hope this story finds you in a peaceful place, ready to receive some comfort and inspiration. No matter what corner of the globe you're listening from, you're part of our Sacred Slumber family. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber for more stories like this one that will nourish your soul and bring peace to your heart. Tonight, we're going to journey together through one of the most remarkable stories ever told, the true account of Joseph, a young man whose life teaches us profound lessons about resilience, faith, and the mysterious ways that purpose unfolds even in our darkest moments. This is a story that has inspired millions across centuries, reminding us that no matter how deep our pit may seem, there's always hope for palace moments ahead. In the ancient land of Canaan, where the sun painted golden hues across rolling hills dotted with olive trees and grazing flocks, there lived a patriarch named Jacob. His tents were pitched near Hebron, and his wealth was measured not in gold or silver, but in the size of his herds and the strength of his family. Jacob had 12 sons, but among them all one held a special place in his father's heart. Joseph was 17 years old, with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and a spirit that seemed to dance with dreams. He was the son of Rachel, Jacob's but loved wife, who had died giving birth to Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother. Perhaps it was the memory of Rachel that made Jacob's love for Joseph burn so brightly. Or perhaps it was something else, a recognition of the extraordinary destiny that seemed to hover around this particular son like morning mist around a mountain peak. The favouritism was evident to everyone in the household. While Joseph's older brothers, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar and Zebulun worked hard in the fields tending the flocks, Joseph often remained close to home. His brothers wore the simple, practical garments of shepherds, but Joseph wore something entirely different. One day Jacob called Joseph to his tent. The old man's hands, weathered by years of labour and life, held a garment that took Joseph's breath away. It was a coat of many colours, rich blues like the depths of the sea, vibrant reds like the sunset over the desert, brilliant yellows like fields of grain, and deep purples like the robes of kings. The fabric was fine, the workmanship exquisite. It was not the coat of a shepherd, but the robe of a prince. "My son," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the coat on Joseph's shoulders, "this is for you. You are precious to me beyond measure." Joseph felt the weight of the coat, but more than that, he felt the weight of his father's love and the unspoken promise it contained. As he walked among his brothers wearing this magnificent garment, he could feel their eyes following him, eyes that had grown cold with resentment and hard with jealousy. But the coat was only the beginning. Joseph had always been a dreamer, but now his dreams took on a quality that was both wonderful and troubling. One morning, as the family gathered for their meal, Joseph could no longer contain the vision that had visited him in the night. "Listen to this dream I had," Joseph said, his voice bright with excitement and innocence. "We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." The silence that followed was deafening. His brothers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Reuben's jaw tightened. Simeon's hands clenched into fists. Judah shook his head in disgust. "Do you intend to reign over us?" Simeon asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Will you actually rule us?" But Joseph, in his youthful enthusiasm, seemed oblivious to the storm clouds gathering around him. Soon after he had another dream, even more vivid than the first. "Listen," he said one evening as the family sat around the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Even Jacob was troubled by this dream. "What is this dream you had?" he asked. his voice carrying a note of concern. "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Though Jacob rebuked Joseph publicly, privately he pondered these words in his heart. There was something about his son's dreams that felt different from ordinary night visions. They carried the weight of prophecy, the sense of divine purpose. But for Joseph's brothers, these dreams were the final straw. Their hatred for Joseph grew like a cancer, fed by jealousy and watered by resentment. The brothers could hardly speak a civil word to Joseph anymore. When he approached, conversation stopped. When he tried to join their work, they found reasons to send him away. The coat of many colours became a symbol of everything they despised about their father's favouritism and their brother's apparent arrogance. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were grazing the flocks near Dothan, several days' journey from home. As Joseph set out, wearing his beautiful coat and carrying provisions for his brothers, he had no idea that he was walking toward a destiny that would change not only his life, but the course of history itself. The brothers saw him coming from a long distance, the colours of his coat visible even across the rolling hills. As that familiar figure approached, the resentment that had been building for years finally reached its boiling point. "Here comes that dreamer," one of them said with venom. "Let's kill him," another suggested. "We can throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." For a moment, murder hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. But Reuben, the eldest, felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "Let's not take his life," he said quickly. "Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Privately, Reuben planned to rescue Joseph later and return him to their father. When Joseph finally reached his brothers, he greeted them with a smile, completely unaware of the dark thoughts that had been brewing in their hearts. But instead of the warm welcome he expected, they seized him roughly. Hands that should have embraced him tore at his beautiful coat, stripping it from his body. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, they had grabbed him and thrown him into an empty cistern. The pit was deep and dry, its walls smooth stone that offered no hope of escape. As Joseph hit the bottom, the breath knocked from his lungs. He looked up to see the circle of sky above growing smaller as his brothers walked away. The silence was overwhelming. One moment he had been walking free under the open sky, and the next he was trapped in a hole in the ground, abandoned by his own family. Above him, his brothers sat down to eat their meal as if nothing had happened. The casual way they consumed their bread and cheese while their brother suffered below spoke volumes about how completely their hearts had been hardened by jealousy. But God's purposes are rarely thwarted by human cruelty. And even as Joseph sat in that pit, wondering if he would die there, divine providence was already at work. In the distance, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders appeared on the horizon, their camels loaded with spices, balm and myrrh bound for Egypt. Judah, perhaps feeling some stirring of conscience, looked at his brothers and said, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." The brothers agreed, seeing an opportunity to rid themselves of Joseph while making a profit. They pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him to the traders for 20 shekels of silver. As the caravan disappeared into the distance with Joseph bound among the slaves, the brothers took his coat of many colours and tore it. Then they killed a goat and dipped the coat in its blood. When they returned home, they presented the bloodied coat to their father. "We found this," they said. "Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Jacob recognized it immediately. The colours that had once brought him such joy now brought only anguish. "It is my son's robe," he cried. "Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Jacob tore his clothes in grief and put on sackcloth. He mourned for his son many days, and though all his sons and daughters came to comfort him, he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." Meanwhile, the caravan carrying Joseph continued its journey toward Egypt, each step taking him further from everything he had ever known and loved. As the young man looked back at the fading hills of his homeland, he could not have imagined that this betrayal, this moment that felt like the end of everything, was actually the beginning of a story that would demonstrate the power of God to bring beauty from ashes and purpose from pain. The journey to Egypt was long and grueling. Joseph, who had never known anything but comfort and privilege, now found himself chained among slaves, his feet bloody from walking across rough terrain, his throat parched from the desert sun. The traders were not cruel, but neither were they kind. He was simply merchandise to them, a commodity to be delivered in good condition to fetch the best price. As the caravan crested the final hill before entering Egypt, Joseph's eyes widened at the sight before him. Egypt was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The Nile River stretched like a blue ribbon through the landscape, its banks lined with lush green vegetation that stood in stark contrast to the golden desert beyond. Pyramids rose majestically in the distance, monuments to the power and sophistication of this ancient civilization. The cities teemed with activity, merchants hawking their wares, craftsmen plying their trades, and everywhere the bustle of a society that had mastered the art of turning the desert into a garden. In the slave market of Memphis, Joseph stood with the others as potential buyers examined them like livestock. His youth and obvious intelligence caught the eye of several bidders, but it was Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, who ultimately purchased him. Potiphar was a man of considerable wealth and influence, with a household that required numerous servants to maintain its operations. Joseph's new life began in Potiphar's house, where he was assigned to work among the other servants. Everything about his circumstances had changed. He who had once worn a coat of many colours now dressed in the simple linen of a slave. He who had once been served was now serving others. He who had once been the favoured son was now property, with no rights and no freedom. But something remarkable happened in Potiphar's house. Instead of becoming bitter or despondent, Joseph chose to serve with excellence. When he was given a task, he completed it better than anyone expected. When he was assigned to care for something, he treated it as if it were his own. His attitude was not that of a man who'd been wronged, but of someone who understood that his character was more important than his circumstances. It didn't take long for Potiphar to notice this exceptional young man. While other servants did only what was required of them, Joseph anticipated needs before they were expressed. He learned the Egyptian language with remarkable speed, mastered the customs of the household, and demonstrated an administrative ability that was far beyond his years. Most importantly, there was something about Joseph's presence that seemed to bring blessing wherever he went. Potiphar began to entrust Joseph with greater responsibilities. First, he made him his personal attendant. Then he put him in charge of his household affairs. Before long, Joseph was managing all of Potiphar's possessions, his property, his servants, his business dealings. The Egyptian captain of the guard had never seen anything like it. Everything that Joseph touched seemed to prosper. Years passed, and Joseph grew from a teenager into a handsome young man. The hardships he had endured had not broken him, but had instead forged him into someone of remarkable character and capability. Potiphar trusted him completely, to the point where he concerned himself with nothing except the food he ate. Everything else was in Joseph's capable hands. But success and favour can sometimes bring their own dangers, and Joseph was about to face a test that would prove even more challenging than the pit his brothers had thrown him into. Potiphar's wife had noticed the young Hebrew slave who had risen to such prominence in her household. Joseph was not only capable and trustworthy, but he had grown into a man of striking appearance. Day after day she watched him as he went about his duties with quiet dignity and remarkable competence. Soon, watching was not enough. "Come to bed with me," she said to Joseph one day when they found themselves alone. Joseph was stunned by her proposition. The wife of his master, a woman of rank and privilege, was propositioning a slave. But Joseph's response revealed the depth of his character and the strength of his convictions. "No," he said firmly but respectfully. "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Day after day she spoke to Joseph, but he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. Joseph understood that betraying Potiphar's trust would not only be wrong, but it would also be a sin against the God who had been with him through all his trials. His integrity was not for sale, regardless of the price or the pressure. But a person determined to do wrong will often become vindictive when their advances are rejected. Potiphar's wife's desire turned to anger, and her anger to a determination for revenge. She waited for the right opportunity, and one day when Joseph came into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside, she made her move. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But Joseph left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Holding his cloak as evidence, Potiphar's wife called to the household servants. "Look," she said, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When Potiphar came home, his wife told him the same story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Potiphar burned with anger. The man he had trusted above all others, the servant who had brought such blessing to his household, had apparently betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Without investigation, without hearing Joseph's side of the story, Potiphar had Joseph seized and thrown into prison, the same prison where the king's prisoners were confined. Once again, Joseph found himself in a pit, though this time it was made of stone and iron rather than earth. Once again, he had been betrayed by those he had served faithfully. Once again, his circumstances had changed dramatically through no fault of his own. He had done the right thing, had maintained his integrity, had honoured God, and his reward was imprisonment for a crime he had not committed. Many people would have become bitter at this point. They would have questioned why God allowed such injustice, why faithfulness seemed to be rewarded with suffering. They might have decided that integrity was not worth the cost, that doing right was foolish when it led to such consequences. But Joseph was not like most people. Even in prison, even after being falsely accused and unjustly punished, something within him refused to give up hope. He had learned that his circumstances did not define him, his character did. He had discovered that God's presence was not dependent on favourable conditions, but was available even in the darkest places. And remarkably, even in prison, Joseph began to prosper. The warden noticed this unusual prisoner who carried himself with such dignity, who treated others with such respect, who seemed to bring order and blessing wherever he went. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and made him responsible for all that was done in the prison. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Once again, Joseph had taken a situation that seemed hopeless and had found a way to serve with excellence, to lead with integrity, and to trust that somehow, in ways he could not yet see, God was working all things together for good. But the greatest tests of Joseph's faith were still ahead, and the prison that seemed like an ending was actually preparing him for a beginning that would astonish the world. Prison has a way of stripping away everything except what truly matters. In the Egyptian jail where Joseph now found himself, surrounded by stone walls and iron bars, the external trappings of success and status meant nothing. Here, in this place reserved for those who had supposedly committed crimes against Pharaoh, Joseph faced the ultimate test of his character. Days turned into months, and months into years. Joseph had now spent more time as a slave and prisoner than he had as the favoured son in his father's house. The dreams of his youth, the sheaves bowing down, the sun and moon and stars paying homage, seemed like the fantasies of another lifetime. If someone had asked him during those long, dark nights whether he still believed in those dreams, he might have wondered himself. But Joseph had learned something profound during his years of hardship, that faith is not about understanding God's timeline, but about trusting God's character. He had seen evidence of divine favour even in the darkest circumstances. When he was in Potiphar's house, God had blessed his work. Now, even in prison, he could see the same pattern. Blessing flowing through him to benefit others. Success following him, even in the most unlikely places. The other prisoners noticed something different about Joseph. While many of them spent their time in despair, anger, or plotting revenge, Joseph maintained a remarkable sense of peace. He listened to their stories with compassion, helped resolve disputes with wisdom, and carried himself with a dignity that prison walls could not diminish. The warden had made him the unofficial leader among the prisoners, and everyone, guards and inmates alike, respected him. One morning, Joseph noticed that two of his fellow prisoners seemed particularly troubled. They were not ordinary criminals, but former members of Pharaoh's household, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Both had been imprisoned for offences against their royal master, and both carried themselves with the dignity of men, accustomed to positions of privilege and responsibility. "Why do you look so sad today?" Joseph asked them. The cupbearer answered, "We both had dreams, but there is no one to interpret them." In the ancient world, dreams were considered messages from the gods, and their interpretation was a specialized skill typically reserved for trained priests and wise men. To have a significant dream and no way to understand its meaning was a source of genuine distress. Joseph's response revealed both his humility and his faith. "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." The chief cupbearer went first. "In my dream," he said, "I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." Joseph listened carefully, and as the cupbearer spoke, understanding came to him with a clarity that felt like sunrise after a long night. "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." The cupbearer's face lit up with hope. Joseph continued, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favourable interpretation to the cupbearer's dream, he eagerly shared his own vision. "I too had a dream," he said. "On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." Joseph's expression grew grave as he received understanding of this dream as well. The interpretation was not pleasant, but Joseph knew he had to speak the truth. "This is what it means," he said gently. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." 3 days later, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The accuracy of Joseph's interpretation should have marked him as a man of extraordinary ability, someone worthy of attention and favour. The chief cupbearer had been restored to his position of influence, with direct access to the most powerful man in Egypt. Surely he would remember the prisoner who had correctly interpreted his dream and had specifically asked to be remembered. But the chief cupbearer forgot about Joseph. This forgetting was perhaps one of the most difficult trials Joseph had yet faced. It was not the active betrayal of his brothers or the false accusation of Potiphar's wife, but the passive neglect of someone who simply failed to keep his word. Day after day, Joseph waited, hoping that this would be the day when guards would come to release him, when word would arrive that Pharaoh wanted to see him. But the days passed in silence. Months turned into a year, and then another year. 2 full years passed, and still the cupbearer, busy with his restored duties and privileges, did not remember the Hebrew slave who had correctly interpreted his dream. It was as if Joseph had been forgotten not just by one man, but by the entire world. During these 2 years of waiting, Joseph could have become bitter. He could have concluded that helping others was pointless, that kindness was wasted on those who would not return it. He could have decided that his gift for interpreting dreams was worthless if it could not even secure his own freedom. Many people would have given up hope entirely. But Joseph continued to trust, continued to serve, continued to maintain his character even when it seemed to bring no reward. He understood something that many people never learn, that our calling is to be faithful, not to control outcomes. His job was to use his gifts with integrity and kindness. God's job was to handle the timing and the results. In the darkness of those 2 forgotten years, Joseph's faith was refined like gold in a furnace. The dreams of his youth were still alive within him, but they had been purified of any pride or presumption. He was learning that God's promises are always fulfilled, but rarely on our timeline or in the way we expect. And unbeknownst to Joseph, his time of preparation was nearly complete. All the lessons he had learned about integrity under pressure, about leadership in difficult circumstances, about maintaining faith when it seemed unrewarded, were about to be put to their ultimate test. The pit had prepared him for the palace, but first he would need to prove that he was ready for both the privilege and the responsibility that awaited him. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic turnarounds in human history, and the forgotten prisoner was about to become the second most powerful man in the greatest empire on earth. Pharaoh stood on the balcony of his palace, looking out over the magnificent kingdom that stretched as far as the eye could see. The Nile flowed majestically past the royal residence, its waters reflecting the first light of dawn. Egypt was at the height of its power and prosperity, with abundant harvests, thriving trade, and monuments that would stand for millennia as testaments to its greatness. But on this particular morning, Pharaoh was deeply troubled. For 2 nights in a row, he had been visited by dreams so vivid and disturbing that they left him unable to rest. These were not ordinary dreams. They carried the weight of divine communication, the sense that the gods were trying to tell him something of vital importance. But what? The first dream had been strange and unsettling. Pharaoh had dreamed he was standing by the Nile when 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the river and began grazing among the reeds. Then 7 other cows came up out of the river after them, but these were ugly and gaunt, more wasted and emaciated than any cattle Pharaoh had ever seen in all of Egypt. The ugly, gaunt cows ate up the 7 fat, sleek cows, but even after eating them, they looked just as ugly and gaunt as before. The second dream was equally mysterious. This time, Pharaoh saw 7 heads of grain growing on a single stalk, healthy and good. Then 7 other heads sprouted after them, but these were thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Pharaoh woke from each dream with a sense of foreboding that he could not shake. These dreams meant something, but what? He immediately called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, men who were trained in the ancient arts of dream interpretation and divine communication. They came quickly at their king's summons, eager to demonstrate their wisdom and earn royal favour. But as Pharaoh recounted his dreams to them, something unprecedented happened. These men, who had built their reputations on their ability to interpret dreams and divine the will of the gods, were completely baffled. They offered various theories and possibilities, but none of them carried the ring of truth. Pharaoh could sense their uncertainty, their fumbling attempts to provide answers they simply did not have. It was in this moment of royal frustration and growing anxiety that the chief cupbearer suddenly remembered something, or rather someone, he had forgotten for 2 long years. "Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings," the cupbearer said, approaching Pharaoh with obvious embarrassment. "Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream, and things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." Pharaoh's eyes sharpened with interest. A Hebrew slave who could interpret dreams with perfect accuracy, when his own wise men were stumped. "Send for him immediately," Pharaoh commanded. Guards rushed to the prison and found Joseph. "Pharaoh wants to see you," they announced. "Quickly, make yourself presentable." Joseph could hardly believe what he was hearing. After more than a decade in Egypt, first as a slave, then as a prisoner, he was suddenly being summoned to appear before the most powerful man on earth. He shaved, changed his clothes, and tried to prepare himself mentally for whatever was about to happen. As Joseph was led into the royal presence, he could not help but be awed by the magnificence that surrounded him. The palace was a testament to Egypt's wealth and sophistication, with soaring columns, intricate carvings, and precious metals gleaming everywhere. Pharaoh himself sat on a throne that seemed to embody the power and mystery of the gods, dressed in robes that spoke of unimaginable authority. "I had a dream," Pharaoh said without preamble, "and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream you can interpret it." Joseph's response revealed the humility and faith that had sustained him through all his trials. "I cannot do it," Joseph replied, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." This was a remarkable statement for several reasons. First, Joseph gave no credit to himself, acknowledging that any ability he had came from God. Second, he was confident that God would provide the interpretation, even though he had not yet heard the dreams. Third, he was willing to stand before the most powerful man on earth and speak about his Hebrew God, a courageous act that could have had serious consequences if Pharaoh had taken offense. Pharaoh proceeded to tell Joseph both of his dreams in detail, describing the fat and gaunt cows, the healthy and withered grain. As he spoke, Joseph listened with the same careful attention he had given to the dreams of his fellow prisoners years earlier. When Pharaoh finished, Joseph spoke with clarity and confidence that amazed everyone present. "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same," he said. "God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine." Joseph continued, his voice carrying the authority of divine revelation. "It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon." But Joseph did not stop with the interpretation. Drawing on his years of experience in administration and his natural wisdom, he offered practical advice for dealing with the crisis that was coming. "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and scope. During the 7 years of abundance, Egypt would systematically store 1/5 of each harvest. This would require massive organisational skills, enormous storage facilities, and careful distribution networks. It would be one of the most ambitious administrative undertakings in human history. Pharaoh and his officials were amazed not only by the interpretation, which had the unmistakable ring of truth, but also by the comprehensive plan Joseph had outlined. Here was a man who could not only understand divine communication, but could also translate that understanding into practical action. "Can we find anyone like this man?" Pharaoh asked his officials. "One in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." And so, in a single day, Joseph went from being a forgotten prisoner to being the second most powerful man in Egypt, Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Pharaoh also gave Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah, and gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, to be his wife. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. 13 years had passed since his brothers had thrown him into that pit in Dothan. 13 years of slavery, false accusation, imprisonment, and being forgotten. But now those years of preparation were revealed as exactly that. Preparation for a responsibility that would affect not just Egypt, but the entire known world. As Joseph began his new role, organising the massive project of storing grain for the coming famine, he could not help but remember the dreams of his youth. The sheaves bowing down, the sun and moon and stars paying homage. Those dreams had seemed so impossible during the dark years of his trials. But now he was beginning to see how God had been weaving a story of redemption that was far grander than anything he could have imagined as a 17-year-old boy in his father's house. The 7 years of abundance began exactly as Joseph had predicted, and Egypt's harvests were more bountiful than anyone could remember. Under Joseph's careful supervision, vast storehouses were built in every city, and grain was collected and preserved on an unprecedented scale. The administrative system he designed was so efficient and comprehensive that it became a model for future generations. During this time, Joseph and his wife Asenath were blessed with 2 sons. He named the first Manasseh, saying, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim, saying, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." These names revealed Joseph's heart. He was grateful for the blessing of forgetting the pain of his past, but he also recognized that God had made him fruitful precisely in the place where he had suffered most. His trials had not been meaningless. They had been the very soil in which his greatest purpose had grown. As the 7 years of abundance came to an end and the 7 years of famine began, Joseph's careful preparations proved their worth. While neighbouring countries struggled with crop failures and starvation, Egypt had grain in abundance. People came from all over the known world to buy food from Joseph, and Egypt became the lifeline for countless nations. The famine was severe throughout the world, and it reached even into the land of Canaan where Jacob lived with his family. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, with the others, because he feared that harm might come to him. Benjamin was now the only remaining son of his beloved Rachel, and Jacob could not bear the thought of losing him too. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt and came before him to buy grain, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognized them immediately, but they did not recognize him. Here was the fulfillment of his boyhood dreams, his brothers bowing before him, but it came not with triumph, but with the weight of enormous responsibility. Joseph remembered his dreams about them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he demanded. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Joseph accused them of being spies, testing them to see what kind of men they had become. Through a series of encounters, he kept Simeon as a prisoner and demanded that they bring Benjamin to prove their honesty. When they returned with Benjamin, Joseph's emotions nearly overwhelmed him, but he continued to test them. The final test came when Joseph had his silver cup planted in Benjamin's sack, then accused him of theft. When the cup was found, Joseph declared that Benjamin would become his slave. It was then that Judah, the same brother who had suggested selling Joseph years before, stepped forward and offered to take Benjamin's place as a slave, saying he could not bear to see his father's grief if Benjamin did not return. This act of selfless love broke Joseph's heart. His brothers had changed. The jealous, cruel men who had thrown him into a pit were now willing to sacrifice themselves for each other and for their father's happiness. Joseph could no longer control himself. he sent all his attendants away and revealed himself to his brothers. "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" he said, weeping so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. His brothers were terrified, but Joseph reassured them, "Come close to me. I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no ploughing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." This was the heart of Joseph's story, not revenge, but redemption, not bitterness, but blessing. He had learned to see God's hand even in the betrayal and suffering he had endured. "You intended to harm me," he would later tell them, "but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph brought his entire family to Egypt, where they were given the best land in Goshen. Jacob, who had mourned Joseph as dead for over 20 years, was reunited with his beloved son. The family was restored, the famine was survived, and the promises God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob continued to unfold through their descendants. When Jacob died years later, Joseph's brothers feared that he might finally take revenge on them. But Joseph wept and said, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." Joseph lived to be 110 years old, seeing his family multiply and prosper in Egypt. Before he died, he made his brothers promise that when God eventually led them back to the Promised Land, they would carry his bones with them. Even in death, Joseph's faith looked forward to the fulfillment of God's promises. Joseph's story teaches us that God can use even the worst circumstances to accomplish his greatest purposes. The pit prepared Joseph for the palace, but more importantly it prepared his heart for forgiveness. His sufferings were not meaningless. They were the very experiences that shaped him into a man capable of saving nations and reconciling families. In our own lives we may face betrayal, false accusations, forgotten promises, and years of waiting that seem endless. But Joseph's story reminds us that God is always working, even when we cannot see his hand. Our calling is not to understand his timeline, but to trust his character and remain faithful in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. The dreams God gives us may take decades to fulfill, and they may come to pass in ways we never expected. But his promises are sure, his purposes are good, and his love never fails. From the pit to the palace, from slavery to salvation, from betrayal to blessing. This is the pattern of redemption that runs through Joseph's story, and through our own lives when we place our trust in the God who makes all things work together for good. Rest well tonight, dear friends of Sacred Slumber, knowing that your story too is being written by a loving God who specializes in turning mourning into dancing, ashes into beauty, and the deepest valleys into the highest mountains of purpose and joy. Sweet dreams, and may you find peace in knowing that no matter what pit you may find yourself in today, God is already preparing your palace for tomorrow.
The fire on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Hello everyone, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we dive into today's powerful message, I want to connect with each of you personally. How has your day been treating you so far? Whether you're watching this in the early morning hours as the sun rises, during your lunch break, in the middle of a busy day, or perhaps late at night when the world has quieted down, I want you to know that this moment we're sharing together is sacred. I'm curious about where you're joining us from today. Are you listening from bustling New York City, the peaceful countryside of Iowa, the sunny beaches of California, or maybe you're tuning in from across the globe, in London, Sydney, or somewhere in between. Wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, you are exactly where God wants you to be right now. If this is your first time joining us, I want to extend a warm welcome to our Sacred Rest family. We're so grateful you're here. And if you've been walking this journey with us, thank you for your continued faithfulness and support. Before we begin today's incredible story, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber if you haven't already. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these life-changing messages that God has in store for us. Now let's prepare our hearts for what I believe will be one of the most dramatic, faith-building stories you'll hear. Today we're travelling back over 2,800 years to witness one of the most spectacular demonstrations of God's power ever recorded in human history. We're going to Mount Carmel in ancient Israel, where one man's faith stood against an entire nation's rebellion, where fire fell from heaven, and where hearts were turned back to the one true God. The fire on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Chapter 1. A nation in spiritual freefall. Picture, if you will, the ancient kingdom of Israel during one of its darkest hours. This wasn't just a time of political upheaval or economic hardship, though both of those existed. This was a time of complete spiritual catastrophe, a moment when an entire nation had turned its back on the God who had delivered them from slavery in Egypt, who had parted the Red Sea, who had given them the Promised Land. King Ahab sat on the throne of Israel, and beside him ruled Queen Jezebel, a woman whose very name has become synonymous with wickedness and manipulation. Jezebel wasn't just content to worship false gods herself. She was determined to drag the entire nation of Israel down with her into the depths of idolatry and spiritual darkness. Under their reign, temples to Baal began sprouting up across the landscape like poisonous mushrooms after a storm. Baal was the Canaanite storm god, supposedly the controller of rain and fertility, the giver of crops and abundance. The people were drawn to him because they believed he could provide what they desperately needed: prosperity, security, and success. Sound familiar? In our modern world, we may not bow down to statues of Baal, but how many of us have made idols out of our careers, our bank accounts, our social media followers, or our pursuit of comfort and pleasure? The heart of humanity hasn't changed much in nearly 3,000 years. But Jezebel wasn't satisfied with just building temples. She launched a systematic persecution campaign against the prophets of the Lord. These faithful men and women of God were hunted down like criminals. Some were executed, others were forced to hide in caves and secret places, living in constant fear for their lives. The word of God was being silenced, and darkness was spreading across the land like a plague. Can you imagine living in such a time, when speaking the truth about God could cost you your life, when the very foundations of faith that had sustained a nation for generations were being torn down brick by brick, when it seemed like evil had won and righteousness had fled? Yet in the midst of this spiritual holocaust, God had his man. His name was Elijah, and he was about to become the most famous prophet in Israel's history. Chapter 2. The Drought of Divine Judgment. Before we meet Elijah face to face, we need to understand the backdrop against which his ministry unfolded. For 3 long years, not a single drop of rain had fallen on the land of Israel. This wasn't just an inconvenient dry spell or a minor weather pattern. This was divine judgment, God's response to a nation that had forgotten him and chased after false gods. The drought was devastating in ways that are hard for us to fully comprehend in our modern world of grocery stores and water systems. Rivers that had flowed for centuries dried up to cracked mud. Wells that had sustained families for generations ran completely dry. Crops withered in the fields, livestock died, and famine stalked the land like a relentless predator. People were desperate. Children cried from hunger. Farmers watched helplessly as their fields turned to dust. Merchants had nothing to sell, and families had nothing to eat. The very fabric of society was unravelling under the weight of this supernatural judgment. And yet, in their desperation, most of the people didn't turn back to the Lord. Instead, they cried out even more desperately to Baal, pleading with the storm god to send rain. They increased their sacrifices, intensified their rituals, and multiplied their prayers to deaf idols. They were convinced that if they just tried harder, if they just offered more, if they just believed with greater fervour, Baal would answer and the rains would come. But the skies remained as bronze, hard and unyielding. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, the sun blazed down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. The drought continued, and Baal remained silent. This is the world into which God sent his prophet Elijah. Not a comfortable world of revival meetings and supportive congregations, but a hostile environment where speaking God's truth could mean death, where the majority had embraced lies and where the very elements seemed to declare that God's judgment was upon the land. Chapter 3. Enter Elijah, the man of fire. Elijah appears in the biblical narrative like a bolt of lightning splitting the darkness. We don't know much about his background or his early life. He's introduced simply as Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead. No impressive genealogy, no royal connections, no seminary degrees or credentials. Just a man from a small town that most people had probably never heard of. But what Elijah lacked in pedigree, he more than made up for in faith, courage, and an unshakable conviction that the Lord God of Israel was the one true God. While the nation around him bowed to Baal, Elijah stood firm. While others compromised and conformed, Elijah remained faithful. While the majority chose the easy path of popular religion, Elijah chose the narrow way of truth. God had sustained Elijah supernaturally during the 3 years of drought. First, he had sent him to the brook Cherith, where ravens brought him bread and meat every morning and evening, and he drank from the brook. When the brook dried up, God sent him to a widow in Zarephath, where a handful of flour and a little oil miraculously sustained 3 people for over a year. These experiences had built Elijah's faith to an unshakable level. He had seen God's provision in impossible circumstances. He had witnessed miracles that defied natural law. He had learned to trust completely in God's power and faithfulness, even when everything around him suggested that God had forgotten or abandoned his people. Now, as the drought entered its 3rd year, God was ready to use his seasoned servant for the greatest demonstration of divine power Israel had seen since the days of Moses. The time had come for a showdown that would echo through the ages, a confrontation that would prove once and for all who was the true God and who were merely the inventions of human imagination. Chapter 4. The Divine Commission. The word of the Lord came to Elijah with crystal clarity. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. It was time for the drought to end, but first there would be a reckoning. God wasn't just going to quietly restore the rain and let everyone go back to their lives as if nothing had happened. He was going to make a statement that would be impossible to ignore or explain away. Elijah set out to find King Ahab, but Ahab was already looking for him. The king had been searching throughout his own kingdom and in neighbouring nations, trying to find the prophet he blamed for the drought. When Ahab finally encountered Elijah, his greeting was filled with accusation and anger. Is that you troubler of Israel? Can you imagine the audacity? Here was a king who had led his nation into idolatry, who had allowed his wife to murder God's prophets, who had built temples to false gods throughout the land, and he had the nerve to call God's faithful prophet a troublemaker. It's a perfect example of how sin blinds us to our own responsibility and causes us to blame others for the consequences of our own choices. But Elijah didn't back down. With the boldness that comes from knowing you're standing on the side of truth, he fired back. "I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." This wasn't just a theological debate or a polite disagreement about religious preferences. This was a confrontation between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness, between truth and deception, between the power of the Almighty and the impotence of human-made idols. Chapter 5. The challenge issued. Elijah then issued a challenge that would go down in history as one of the most dramatic moments in all of Scripture. "Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." Mount Carmel was the perfect location for this showdown. Rising about 1,800 feet above sea level, it offered a commanding view of the surrounding countryside and could accommodate the massive crowd that would gather. More importantly, Mount Carmel was considered sacred to Baal worship. The Canaanites believed it was one of Baal's favourite dwelling places. By choosing this location, Elijah was essentially challenging Baal on his home turf. The terms of the contest were elegantly simple. "Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." It was brilliant in its simplicity. No complicated rituals, no ambiguous signs that could be interpreted different ways, no room for trickery or deception. Fire from heaven would be the ultimate proof. The God who could send fire to consume the sacrifice would be proven to be the true God. The people's response revealed both their spiritual confusion and their deep hunger for truth. What you say is good. They were tired of the uncertainty, tired of not knowing which God to trust, tired of the drought and the suffering. They wanted a clear answer, and Elijah's challenge offered exactly that. Chapter 6. The prophets of Baal take the stage. As dawn broke over Mount Carmel, an incredible scene began to unfold. Hundreds of prophets of Baal gathered around their altar, dressed in their ceremonial robes, carrying their ritual instruments, confident in their God's ability to answer their call. After all, they outnumbered Elijah 450 to 1. They had the backing of the royal court. They had been the religious establishment for years. Surely their God would not fail them now, especially not on his sacred mountain. They began their ritual early in the morning with great enthusiasm and confidence. "Baal, answer us," they cried, their voices echoing across the mountainside. They danced around their altar with wild abandon, their movements becoming more and more frenzied as they worked themselves into a religious fervour. This wasn't a quiet, dignified ceremony. This was raw, primal religion at its most intense. They leaped and shouted, they waved their arms and beat their chests. They called upon their God with every fibre of their being. The sound of their voices, the pounding of their feet, the clashing of their instruments created a cacophony that could be heard for miles around. But as the morning wore on and became noon, something became increasingly obvious. Nobody was answering. The sky remained clear and cloudless. No fire fell from heaven. No voice spoke from the heavens. The the altar remained cold and lifeless, despite all their passionate pleading. You have to understand, these weren't insincere men going through empty motions. These prophets genuinely believed in Baal. They had devoted their lives to serving him. They had staked their reputations, their careers, and their very identities on the belief that he was real and powerful. The failure of their God to respond wasn't just embarrassing, it was devastating to everything they had built their lives upon. Chapter 7. Elijah's Divine Sarcasm. As the noon sun blazed overhead and the prophets of Baal continued their increasingly desperate rituals, Elijah decided it was time for some divine commentary. With a wit that was both cutting and brilliant, he began to mock their futile efforts. "Shout louder! Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or travelling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." Can you imagine the scene? Here's Elijah, one man against 450, calmly watching their frantic efforts and offering helpful suggestions for why their God might not be responding. The sarcasm was devastating because it highlighted the absurdity of their situation. If Baal was truly the almighty storm god they claimed he was, why would he need to be awakened? Why would he be too busy or distracted to answer his devoted followers in their hour of greatest need? But Elijah's mockery served a deeper purpose than just humiliating the false prophets. He was exposing the fundamental weakness of all false gods. They are not truly there. They cannot hear because they have no ears. They cannot speak because they have no voice. They cannot act because they have no power. They are creations of human imagination, given form by human hands, but possessing no divine substance. The prophets of Baal, stung by Elijah's taunts and desperate to prove their God's reality, intensified their efforts to an almost unbelievable degree. They began to cut themselves with swords and spears, following their religious traditions until their blood flowed freely. This wasn't just symbolic, this was literal self-mutilation in the name of religious devotion. From noon until evening, they continued this horrific display, their voices growing hoarse from shouting, their bodies weakened by loss of blood, their spirits crushed by the growing realization that their God was not going to answer. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. On one side, frantic activity and desperate self-harm producing nothing. On the other side, one man waiting calmly for his turn, confident in his God's ability to act. Chapter 8. Elijah prepares his altar. As evening approached and the prophets of Baal finally exhausted themselves in defeat, Elijah stepped forward to take his turn. But before he called upon the Lord, he had some important work to do. "Come here to me," he called to all the people. This wasn't going to be a private ceremony or a mystical ritual performed in secret. Everything Elijah was about to do would be in full view of hundreds or perhaps thousands of witnesses. There would be no opportunity for trickery, no possibility of deception, no room for doubt about what actually happened. The first thing Elijah did was repair the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. This altar represented the nation's covenant relationship with God, a relationship that had been broken by years of idolatry and rebellion. By repairing it, Elijah was symbolically calling the nation back to their true identity as God's chosen people. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, even though the kingdom had been divided for generations. In God's eyes, his people were still one nation, still his chosen ones, still the objects of his covenant love, despite their unfaithfulness. Each stone was a reminder of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, promises that remained in effect despite the people's rebellion. With these 12 stones, Elijah built an altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold about 15 litres of water. This wasn't just for dramatic effect, it was about to serve a very important purpose in demonstrating that what was about to happen could only be attributed to divine intervention. Chapter 9. The Ultimate Act of Faith. What Elijah did next was so audacious, so seemingly foolish, that it takes your breath away. Remember, this was in the 3rd year of a devastating drought. Water was more precious than gold. People were dying of thirst. Every drop was carefully conserved and rationed. And Elijah ordered 4 large jars to be filled with water and poured over the offering and the wood. Can you imagine the gasps from the crowd? Can you picture the shock on people's faces as they watched precious, life-giving water being poured out lavishly over an altar? Some in the crowd probably thought Elijah had lost his mind. Others might have been angry at what seemed like a wasteful display. But Elijah wasn't finished. "Do it again," he said. And they did it a second time, pouring out 4 more jars of precious water over the sacrifice and the wood. "Do it a 3rd time," Elijah commanded. And a 3rd time they soaked the altar until the water ran down around it and filled the trench he had dug. 12 jars of water in total. Everything was completely saturated. The wood was soaked through. The sacrifice was drenched. The stones were wet. Even the ground around the altar was muddy with water. If anyone had been planning to suggest that Elijah had somehow hidden fire or used trickery to ignite his altar, that possibility was now completely eliminated. This act of faith was staggering. Elijah was so confident in God's power that he was willing to make the miracle as difficult as possible. He wasn't just asking God to light dry wood. He was asking him to consume a sacrifice that was literally underwater. He was putting his reputation, his ministry, and his very life on the line, betting everything on God's ability to do the impossible. Chapter 10. The Prayer that Shook Heaven and Earth. As evening approached and the time for the evening sacrifice arrived, Elijah stepped up to the altar he had prepared. The moment had come. Everything led to this point. The drought, the confrontation with Ahab, the challenge to the prophets of Baal, the repair of the altar, the soaking with water, all of it was preparation for this moment when one man would call upon the name of the Lord. But notice what Elijah didn't do. He didn't scream and shout like the prophets of Baal. He didn't dance wildly, or cut himself, or work himself into a frenzy. He didn't perform elaborate rituals, or recite complicated incantations. He simply prayed, and his prayer was a model of faith, simplicity, and complete dependence upon God. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he began, immediately identifying the God he served not as a local deity or a tribal God, but as the God of the covenant, the God who had made promises to the patriarchs and had been faithful to those promises for generations. "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command." This wasn't about Elijah's reputation or glory. This wasn't about proving his own power or wisdom. This was about demonstrating to a watching world that the Lord alone is God, and that Elijah was merely his obedient servant. "Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." The purpose of the miracle wasn't to show off, or to defeat enemies, but to turn hearts back to God. This was an act of divine love, a desperate attempt to rescue a nation from the spiritual destruction they had brought upon themselves. The prayer was short, simple, and powerful. No theatrical performance, no manipulation of emotions, no attempt to work up faith through human effort. Just a straightforward request from a faithful servant to his all-powerful God. Chapter 11. fire falls from heaven. What happened next has never been equalled in human history. The response to Elijah's prayer was immediate, dramatic, and absolutely unmistakable. Fire fell from heaven. Not a small flame that gradually grew, not a spark that ignited the wood, not a natural phenomenon that could be explained by meteorology or chemistry. This was supernatural fire, divine fire, holy fire that blazed down from the throne of God himself. And this fire didn't just consume the sacrifice, it didn't just burn up the wood, it consumed everything. The offering was instantly vaporized. The wood disappeared in a flash. The 12 stones that Elijah had so carefully arranged were completely consumed. Even the soil around the altar was burned up. The water in the trench, all those precious gallons that had been poured out, was licked up by the divine flames as if it had never been there. The heat must have been incredible. The light must have been blinding. The sound must have been like thunder echoing across the mountainside. Everyone watching would have felt the power of God in a way that shook them to their very core. This wasn't just a miracle, it was a demonstration of absolute divine authority. God was making a statement that could not be ignored, denied, or explained away. He was declaring to Israel, to the prophets of Baal, to King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and to everyone watching, that he alone is God, that he alone has power over the elements, and that he alone deserves worship and obedience. Chapter 12. The people's response. When the people saw the fire fall from heaven and consume everything on the altar, their response was immediate and overwhelming. They fell prostrate on the ground, not just kneeling, but face down in the dirt, overwhelmed by the presence and power of the Almighty God. And they cried out in unison, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Think about what this meant. Many of these same people had been worshipping Baal just hours before. They had been convinced that the storm god was real and powerful. They had invested their hopes, their prayers, and their sacrifices in a false deity. But now, confronted with undeniable evidence of God's power, they acknowledged the truth they had been running from for 3 years. This wasn't just an intellectual acknowledgement or a polite religious sentiment. This was a deep, heart-level recognition of divine authority. They had seen something that shattered their old beliefs and transformed their understanding of spiritual reality. The God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the God their fathers had worshipped. He was the true God, and all other gods were mere pretenders. The cry, "The Lord, He is God," became a declaration of faith that echoed across the mountainside and down through the centuries. It was a moment of national awakening, a turning point when an entire people group remembered who they were and whose they were. Chapter 13. Justice and Restoration. But the story didn't end with the people's declaration of faith. God's justice demanded that those who had led the nation astray face the consequences of their deception. Under Elijah's direction, the people seized the 450 prophets of Baal who had spent the day proving the powerlessness of their God. This might seem harsh to our modern sensibilities, but we need to understand the context. These men had been leading an entire nation away from the true God. They had been accomplices in the persecution and murder of God's true prophets. They had been teaching lies in the name of religion, deceiving people who were desperately seeking spiritual truth. Their deception had contributed to the spiritual darkness that had brought God's judgment upon the land. Justice was swift and final. All 450 prophets of Baal were executed, removing the source of false teaching that had poisoned the nation's spiritual life. With the false prophets dealt with and the people's hearts turned back to God, it was time for the next phase of God's plan, the restoration of His blessing upon the land. Chapter 14. The sound of abundant rain. Elijah said to Ahab, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." This statement is remarkable for several reasons. First, there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The weather conditions were identical to what they had been for 3 years. Hot, dry, and utterly cloudless. But Elijah had the faith to hear the sound of rain that existed only in the promise of God. This is the kind of faith that sees the invisible and hears the inaudible. Elijah wasn't looking at circumstances or relying on weather forecasts. He was trusting in the word of God, who had promised to send rain upon the land. While Ahab went to eat and drink, Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel and threw himself down on the ground in prayer. This wasn't a casual request or a polite religious ritual. This was intense, fervent prayer from a man who understood that he was participating in God's plan to restore his people. 7 times Elijah sent his servant to look toward the sea for signs of rain. 6 times the servant returned with the same report. There is nothing there. But Elijah didn't give up. He didn't doubt God's promise or question his own faith. He kept praying, kept believing, kept expecting God to fulfill his word. On the 7th time, the servant returned with different news. A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. To most people, a tiny cloud on the horizon wouldn't seem significant, especially after 3 years of drought. But to the eyes of faith, that small cloud was the beginning of God's abundant provision. Elijah immediately told his servant to run to Ahab with this message: "Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Chapter 15. The Storm of Restoration. What followed was one of the most dramatic weather changes in recorded history. The tiny cloud that had appeared on the horizon quickly grew and multiplied. The sky, which had been clear blue for 3 years, suddenly turned black with storm clouds. The wind began to blow with increasing intensity, and then the rain began to fall. But this wasn't a gentle shower or a light drizzle. This was a torrential downpour, a deluge that made up for 3 years of drought in a matter of hours. The rain came down in sheets so heavy that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. The ground, which had been hard as concrete from years of drought, couldn't absorb the water fast enough, and soon rivers of rainwater were flowing down every hillside and through every valley. It was as if God was saying, "You thought I had forgotten how to send rain? You believed that Baal was the god of storms? Let me show you what real divine power looks like." The storm was so intense that King Ahab, travelling in his royal chariot, had difficulty making the journey back to his palace in Jezreel. But here's one of the most amazing details of the entire story. The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. Picture this scene. A middle-aged prophet who had just spent an entire day in intense spiritual warfare, who had just called down fire from heaven and orchestrated the execution of 450 false prophets who had just prayed intensely for rain. This same man was given supernatural strength to outrun a horse-drawn chariot for about 17 miles through a driving rainstorm. This wasn't natural human endurance. This was divine empowerment, God's way of putting an exclamation point on the entire day's events. Even in the storm, even in the exhaustion that should have followed such an intense spiritual battle, God's power was sufficient to carry his faithful servant. Chapter 16. Lessons for today. The story of Elijah on Mount Carmel is far more than just an exciting historical account. It's a template for understanding how God works in our world today and how he calls each of us to live lives of faith and courage. First, we see the power of standing alone for truth. Elijah was outnumbered 450 to 1, but he wasn't really alone because God was with him. In our culture today, it often feels like those who stand for biblical truth are vastly outnumbered by those who have embraced the false gods of our age. materialism, relativism, hedonism, and secular humanism. But numbers don't determine truth, and God's power isn't limited by human statistics. Second, we learn that false gods will always disappoint. The prophets of Baal cried out to their God from morning until evening, but he never answered because he wasn't real. Today's false gods, money, success, pleasure, power, technology, entertainment, promise fulfillment, but can never deliver on their promises. Only the true God can satisfy the deepest longings of the human heart. Third, we see that God often chooses to work through ordinary people who have extraordinary faith. Elijah wasn't from a prominent family or an influential background. He was just a man who believed God and was willing to stake everything on that belief. God is still looking for such people today, men and women who will trust him completely and obey him fully, regardless of the circumstances or the opposition. Fourth, we learn the importance of prayer in the life of faith. Elijah's prayer was simple but powerful because it was offered in complete faith and alignment with God's will. He wasn't trying to manipulate God or impress people. He was simply communicating with his heavenly Father and trusting him to act according to his promises. Fifth, we see that God's miracles often come after periods of preparation and testing. The 3 years of drought weren't just punishment for sin, they were preparation for a miracle. God was setting the stage for a demonstration of his power that would be undeniable and unforgettable. Sometimes what looks like delay in our lives is actually divine preparation for something greater than we could imagine. Conclusion. Where is your Mount Carmel? As we conclude this incredible story, I want to ask you a personal question. Where is your Mount Carmel? What situation in your life is calling for a clear demonstration of God's power and faithfulness? What false gods have you been trusting instead of the one true God? What impossible circumstance are you facing that only divine intervention can resolve? Maybe you're facing a financial crisis that seems hopeless and you need God to provide for your needs in supernatural ways. Perhaps you're dealing with a health challenge that has left doctors puzzled, and you need the great physician to demonstrate his healing power. It could be that you're struggling with a relationship that seems beyond repair, and you need the God of restoration to work a miracle in your marriage or family. Or maybe your Mount Carmel is more internal. Maybe you've been worshipping the false gods of success, approval, comfort, or control, and you need to experience the reality of God's presence and power in a fresh way. Maybe you've been trying to live the Christian life in your own strength, and you need to discover what it means to depend completely on God's power rather than your own abilities. The same God who answered Elijah's prayer with fire from heaven is still on the throne today. He still hears the prayers of his people. He still demonstrates his power in impossible situations. He still turns hearts back to himself and brings restoration where there has been devastation. But like Elijah, we must be willing to stake everything on God's faithfulness. We must be prepared to stand alone if necessary, to trust when circumstances seem impossible, to pray with faith rather than doubt, and to give God the opportunity to show his power in ways that will leave no doubt about his reality and love. The fire that fell on Mount Carmel that day wasn't just about proving that the Lord is God, though it certainly did that. It was about a loving father reaching out to his wayward children, demonstrating his power not to destroy them but to draw them back to himself. It was about restoration, redemption, and the kind of love that will go to any lengths to rescue those who are precious to him. That same love is reaching out to you today. That same power is available to you in your situation. That same God who answered Elijah is waiting to answer your prayers and demonstrate His faithfulness in your life. The question isn't whether God is able. The question is whether you're willing to trust Him completely, to step out in faith even when the odds seem impossible, and to give Him the opportunity to show His power in your Mount Carmel moment. So I challenge you today, don't settle for the false gods of our culture. Don't be satisfied with a powerless religion that looks good on the surface, but lacks the reality of divine presence. Cry out like the people on Mount Carmel, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." And then watch as the fire of His presence transforms your impossible situation into a testimony of His faithfulness and power. The same God who sent fire from heaven is ready to move in your life today. Are you ready to trust Him completely and see what He will do? Remember to subscribe to Sacred Rest for more life-changing messages like this one. Until next time, may you know the reality of God's presence and power in every area of your life. God bless you.